Chapter 32 The Waking. When France returned to himself, he seemed still to be in a dream. He thought himself in a sepulchre, into which a ray of sunlight in pity scarcely penetrated. He stretched forth his hand and touched stone. He rose to his seat and found himself lying on his bournus in a bed of dry heather, very soft and odoriferous. The vision had fled, and as if the statues had been but shadows from the tomb, they had vanished at his waking. He advanced several paces towards the point from where the light came, and to all the excitement of his dream succeeded the calmness of reality. He found that he was in a grotto, went towards the opening, and through a kind of fanlight saw a blue sea and an azure sky. The air and water were shining in the beams of the morning sun. On the shore the sailors were sitting, chatting and laughing, and at 10 yards from them the boat was at anchor, undulating gracefully on the water. There for some time he enjoyed the fresh breeze which played on his brow, and listened to the dash of the waves on the beach, that left against the rocks a lace of foam as white as silver. He was for some time without reflection or thought for the divine charm which is in the things of nature, especially after a fantastic dream. Then gradually this view of the outer world, so calm, so pure, so grand, reminded him of the elusiveness of his vision, and once more awakened memory. He recalled his arrival on the island, his presentation to a smuggler chief, a subterranean palace full of splendor, an excellent supper, and a spoonful of hashish. It seemed, however, evening in the very face of open day, that at least a year had elapsed since all these things had passed. So deep was the impression made in his mind by the dream, and so strong a hold had it taken of his imagination. Thus every now and then he saw in fancy amid the sailors, seated on a rock, or undulating in the vessel, one of the shadows which had shared his dream with looks and kisses. Otherwise his head was perfectly clear, and his body refreshed. He was free from the slightest headache. On the contrary, he felt a certain degree of lightness, a faculty for absorbing the pure air, and enjoying the bright sunshine more vividly than ever. He went gaily up to the sailors, who rose as soon as they perceived him, and the patron, accosting him, said, "The Signor Sinbad has left his compliments for your excellency, and desires us to express the regret he feels at not being able to take his leave in person, but he trusts you will excuse him, as very important business calls him to Malaga." "So, then, Gitano," said France, "this is, then, all reality. There exists a man who has received me in this island, entertained me royally, and has departed while I was asleep. He exists as certainly as that you may see his small yacht with all her sails spread, and if you will use your glass, you will, in all probability, recognize your host in the amid of his crew." So saying, Gitano pointed in a direction in which a small vessel was making sail towards the southern point of Corsica. France adjusted his telescope and directed it towards the yacht. Gitano was not mistaken. At the stern, the mysterious stranger was standing up looking towards the shore and holding the spyglass in his hand. He was attired as he had been on the previous evening, and waved his pocket handkerchief to his guest in token of adieu. France returned the salute by shaking his handkerchief as an exchange of signals. After a second, a slight cloud of smoke was seen at the stern of the vessel, which rose gracefully as it expanded in the air, and then France heard a slight report. "There, do you hear?" observed Gitano. "He is bidding you adieu." The young man took his carbine and fired it in the air, but without any idea that the noise could be heard at the distance which separated the yacht from the shore. "What are your excellency's orders?" inquired Gitano. "In the first place, light me in a torch." "Ah, yes, I understand," replied the patron, "to find the entrance to the enchanted apartment." "With much pleasure, your excellency, if it would amuse you, and I will get you the torch you ask for. But I too have had the idea you have, and 2 or 3 times the same fancy has come over me. but I have always given it up. Giovanni, light a torch, he added, and give it to His Excellency. Giovanni obeyed. France took the lamp and entered the subterranean grotto, followed by Gitano. He recognized the place where he had awaked by the bed of heather that was there, but it was in vain that he carried his torch all round the exterior surface of the grotto. He saw nothing, unless that, by traces of smoke, others had before him attempted the same thing, and, like him, in vain. Yet he did not leave a foot of this granite wall, as impenetrable as futurity, without strict scrutiny. He did not see a fissure without introducing the blade of his hunting sword into it, or a projecting point on which he did not lean and press in the hopes it would give way. All was vain, and he lost 2 hours in his attempts, which were at last utterly useless. At the end of this time he gave up his search, and Gitano smiled. When France appeared again on the shore, the yacht only seemed like a small white speck on the horizon. He looked again through his glass, but evening then he could not distinguish anything. Gitano reminded him that he had come for the purpose of shooting goats, which he had utterly forgotten. He took his fowling piece and began to hunt over the island with the air of a man who is fulfilling a duty rather than enjoying a pleasure, and at the end of a quarter of an hour he had killed a goat and 2 kids. These animals, though wild and agile as chamois, were too much like domestic goats, and France could not consider them as game. Moreover, other ideas, much more enthralling, occupied his mind. Since, the evening before, he had really been the hero of one of the tales of the 1,001 Nights, and he was irresistibly attracted towards the grotto. Then, in spite of the failure of his first search, he began a second, after having told Gitano to roast one of the 2 kids. The second visit was a long one, and when he returned the kid was roasted and the repast ready. France was sitting on the spot where he was on the previous evening when his mysterious host had invited him to supper, and he saw the little yacht, now like a seagull on the wave, continuing her flight towards Corsica. Why, he remarked to Gitano, you told me that Signor Sinbad was going to Malaga, while it seems he is in the direction of Porto Vecchio. Don't you remember, said the patron, I told you that among the crew there were 2 Corsican brigands? True, and he is going to land them, added France. Precisely so, replied Gitano. Ah, he is one who fears neither God nor Satan, they say, and would at any time run 50 leagues out of his course to do a poor devil a service. But such services as these may involve him with the authorities of the country in which he practices this kind of philanthropy, said France. And what cares he for that, replied Gitano with a laugh, or any authorities? He smiles at them. Let them try to pursue him. Why, in the first place, his yacht is not a ship but a bird, and he would beat any frigate 3 knots in every 9. And if he were to throw himself on the coast, why, is he not certain of finding friends everywhere? It was perfectly clear that the Signor Sinbad, France's host, had the honor of being on excellent terms with the smugglers and bandits along the whole coast of the Mediterranean, and so enjoyed exceptional privileges. As to France, he had no longer any inducement to remain at Monte Cristo. He had lost all hope of detecting the secret of the grotto. He consequently dispatched his breakfast, and his boat being ready, he hastened on board, and they were soon under way. At the moment the boat began her course they lost sight of the yacht, as it disappeared in the Gulf of Porto Vecchio. With it was effaced the last trace of the preceding night, and then supper, Sinbad, hashish, statues, all became a dream for France. The boat sailed on all day and all night, and next morning, when the sun rose, they had lost sight of Monte Cristo. When France had once again set foot on shore, he forgot, for the moment at least, the events which had just passed, while he finished his affairs of pleasure at Florence, and then thought of nothing but how he should rejoin his companion who was awaiting him at Rome. He set out, and on the Saturday evening reached the Eternal City by the mail coach. An apartment, as we have said, had been retained beforehand, and thus he had but to go to Signor Pastrini's hotel. But this was not so easy a matter, for the streets were thronged with people, and Rome was already a prey to that low and feverish murmur which precedes all great events, and at Rome there are 4 great events in every year: the Carnival, Holy Week, Corpus Christi, and the Feast of St. Peter. All the rest of the year the city is in that state of dull apathy between life and death, which renders it similar to a kind of station between this world and the next, a sublime spot, a resting place, full of poetry and character, and at which France had already halted 5 or 6 times, and at each time found it more marvelous and striking. Last he made his way through the mob, which was continually increasing and getting more and more turbulent, and reached the hotel. On his first inquiry he was told, with the impertinence peculiar to hired hackney coachmen and innkeepers with their houses full, that there was no room for him at the Hotel de Londres. Then he sent his card to Signor Pastrini and asked for Albert de Morcerf. This plan succeeded, and Signor Pastrini himself ran to him, excusing himself for having made his Excellency wait, scolding the waiters, taking the candlestick from the porter, who was ready to pounce on the traveler and was about to lead him to Albert, when Morcerf himself appeared. The apartment consisted of 2 small rooms and a parlor. The 2 rooms looked onto the street, a fact which Signor Pastrini commented upon as an inappreciable advantage. The rest of the floor was hired by a very rich gentleman who was supposed to be a Sicilian or Maltese, but the host was unable to decide to which of the 2 nations the traveler belonged. Very good, Signor Pastrini, said France, but we must have some supper instantly, and a carriage for tomorrow and the following days. As to supper, replied the landlord, you shall be served immediately. But as for the carriage, what as to the carriage? Exclaimed Albert. Come, come, Signor Pastrini, no joking. We must have a carriage. Sir, replied the host, we will do all in our power to procure you one. This is all I can say. And when shall we know? Inquired France. To-morrow morning, answered the innkeeper. Oh, the deuce! Then we shall pay the more, that's all, I see plainly. Enough. At Drake's or Aaron's one pays 25 lire for common days, and 30 or 35 lire a day more for Sundays and feast days. Add 5 lire a day more for extras, that will make 40, and there's an end of it. I am afraid if we offer them double that we shall not procure a carriage. Then they must put horses to mine. It is a little worse for the journey, but that's no matter. There are no horses. Albert looked at France like a man who hears a reply he does not understand. Do you understand that, my dear France? No horses? He said, but can't we have post horses? They have been all hired this fortnight, and there are none left but those absolutely requisite for posting. What are we to say to this? Asked France. I say that when a thing completely surpasses my comprehension, I am accustomed not to dwell on that thing, but to pass to another. Is supper ready, Signor Pastrini? Yes, your Excellency. Well, then, let us sup. But the carriage and horses? Said France. Chapter 33. Roman Bandits. The next morning France woke first, and instantly rang the bell. The sound had not yet died away when Signor Pastrini himself entered. Well, Excellency, said the landlord triumphantly, and without waiting for France to question him, I feared yesterday, when I would not promise you anything, that you were too late. There is not a single carriage to be had, that is, for the last 3 days of the carnival. Yes, returned France, for the very 3 days it is most needed. What is the matter? Said Albert, entering. No carriage to be had? Just so, returned France, you have guessed it. Well, your Eternal City is a nice sort of place. That is to say, Excellency, replied Pastrini, who was desirous of keeping up the dignity of the capital of the Christian world in the eyes of his guest, that there are no carriages to be had from Sunday to Tuesday evening, but from now till Sunday you can have 50 if you please. Ah, that is something, said Albert. Today is Thursday, and who knows what may arrive between this and Sunday. 10 or 12,000 travelers will arrive, replied Franz, which will make it still more difficult. My friend, said Morcerf, let us enjoy the present without gloomy forebodings for the future. At least we can have a window. Where? In the Corso. Ah, a window, exclaimed Signor Pastrini, utterly impossible. There was only one left on the 5th floor of the Doria Palace, and that has been let to a Russian prince for 20 sequins a day. The two young men looked at each other with an air of stupefaction. Well, said Franz to Albert, do you know what is the best thing we can do? It is to pass the carnival at Venice. There we are sure of obtaining gondolas if we cannot have carriages. Ah, the devil, no, cried Albert. I came to Rome to see the carnival, and I will, though I see it on stilts. Bravo, an excellent idea. We will disguise ourselves as monster pulcinelos or shepherds of the lands, and we shall have complete success. Do your excellencies still wish for a carriage from now to Sunday morning? Parbleu, said Albert. Do you think we are going to run about on foot in the streets of Rome like lawyers' clerks? I hasten to comply with your excellency's wishes. Only, I tell you, beforehand, the carriage will cost you 6 piasters a day, and as I am not a millionaire, like the gentleman in the next apartments, said Franz, I warn you that as I have been 4 times before at Rome, I know the prices of all the carriages. We will give you 12 piasters for today, tomorrow, and the day after, and then you will make a good profit. But, Excellency, said Pastrini, still striving to gain his point. Now go, returned Franz, or I shall go myself and bargain with your affeditor, who is mine also. He is an old friend of mine, who has plundered me pretty well already, and, in the hope of making more out of me, he will take a less price than the one I offer you. You will lose the preference, and that will be your fault. Do not give yourselves the trouble, Excellency, returned Signor Pastrini, with the smile peculiar to the Italian speculator when he confesses defeat. I will do all I can, and I hope you will be satisfied. And now we understand each other. When do you wish the carriage to be here? In an hour. In an hour it will be at the door. An hour after the vehicle was at the door. It was a hack conveyance, which was elevated to the rank of a private carriage in honor of the occasion, but, in spite of its humble exterior, the young men would have thought themselves happy to have secured it for the last 3 days of the carnival. Excellency, cried the cicerone, seeing Franz approach the window, shall I bring the carriage near to the palace? Accustomed as Franz was to the Italian phraseology, his first impulse was to look round him, but these words were addressed to him. France was the Excellency, the vehicle was the carriage, and the Hotel de Londres was the palace. The genius for laudation characteristic of the race was in that phrase. France and Albert descended, the carriage approached the palace. Their excellencies stretched their legs along the seats. The cicerone sprang into the seat behind. Where do your excellencies wish to go? Asked he. To St. Peter's first, and then to the Colosseum, returned Albert. But Albert did not know that it takes a day to see St. Peter's and a month to study it. The day was passed at St. Peter's alone. Suddenly, the daylight began to fade away. Franz took out his watch. It was 4:30. They returned to the hotel. At the door Franz ordered the coachman to be ready at 8. He wished to show Albert the Colosseum by moonlight, as he had shown him St. Peter's by daylight. When we show a friend a city one has already visited, we feel the same pride as when we point out a woman whose lover we have been. He was to leave the city by the Porta del Popolo, skirt the outer wall, and re-enter by the Porta San Giovanni. Thus they would behold the Colosseum, without finding their impressions dulled by first looking on the Capitol, the Forum, the Arch of Septimus Severus, the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, and the Via Sacra. They sat down to dinner. Signor Pastrini had promised them a banquet. He gave them a tolerable repast. At the end of the dinner he entered in person. France thought that he came to hear his dinner praised and began accordingly, but at the first words he was interrupted. "Excellency," said Pastrini, "I am delighted to have your approbation, but it was not for that I came." "Did you come to tell us you have procured a carriage?" asked Albert, lighting his cigar. "No, and your excellencies will do well not to think of that any longer. At Rome things can or cannot be done. When you are told anything cannot be done, there is an end of it. It is much more convenient at Paris. When anything cannot be done, you pay double, and it is done directly." "That is what all the French say," returned Signor Pastrini, somewhat piqued. "For that reason, I do not understand why they travel." "But," said Albert, emitting a volume of smoke and balancing his chair on its hind legs, "only madmen, or blockheads like us, ever do travel. Men in their senses do not quit their hotel in the Rue du Helder, their walk on the Boulevard de Gand and the Café de Paris. It is of course understood that Albert resided in the aforesaid street, appeared every day on the fashionable walk, and dined frequently at the only restaurant where you can really dine, that is, if you are on good terms with its frequenters." Signor Pastrini remained silent a short time. It was evident that he was musing over this answer, which did not seem very clear. "But," said France, in his turn interrupting his host's meditations, "you had some motive for coming here. May I beg to know what it was?" "Ah, yes, you have ordered your carriage at 8 o'clock precisely?" "I have." "You intend visiting Il Colosseo." "You mean the Colosseum?" "It is the same thing. You have told your coachman to leave the city by the Porta del Popolo, to drive round the walls, and re-enter by the Porta San Giovanni." "These are my words exactly." "Well, this route is impossible." "Impossible. Very dangerous, to say the least." "Dangerous. And why?" "On account of the famous Luigi Vampa." "Pray, who may this famous Luigi Vampa be?" inquired Albert. "He may be very famous at Rome, but I can assure you he is quite unknown at Paris." "What, do you not know him?" "I have not that honor." "You have never heard his name?" "Never." "Well, then, he is a bandit, compared to whom the de Cesaris and the Gasparones were mere children." "Now then, Albert," cried France, "here is a bandit for you at last." "I forewarn you, Signor Pastrini, that I shall not believe one word of what you are going to tell us. Having told you this, begin." "Once upon a time." "Well, go on." Signor Pastrini turned toward France, who seemed to him the more reasonable of the two. We must do him justice. He had had a great many Frenchmen in his house, but had never been able to comprehend them. "Excellency," said he gravely, addressing France, "if you look upon me as a liar, it is useless for me to say anything. It was for your interest." "Albert does not say you are a liar, Signor Pastrini," said France, "but that he will not believe what you are going to tell us. But I will believe all you say, so proceed." "But if your excellency doubt my veracity, Signor Pastrini," returned France, "you are more susceptible than Cassandra, who was a prophetess, and yet no one believed her, while you, at least, are sure of the credence of half your audience. Come, sit down, and tell us all about this Signor Vampa." "I had told your excellency he is the most famous bandit we have had since the days of Mastrilla." "Well, what has this bandit to do with the order I have given the coachman to leave the city by the Porta del Popolo, and to re-enter by the Porta San Giovanni?" "This," replied Signor Pastrini, "that you will go out by one, but I very much doubt your returning by the other." "Why?" asked France. "Because, after nightfall, you are not safe 50 yards from the gates." "On your honor, is that true?" cried Albert. Count, returned Signor Pastrini, hurt at Albert's repeated doubts of the truth of his assertions. I do not say this to you, but to your companion who knows Rome, and knows, too, that these things are not to be laughed at. My dear fellow, said Albert, turning to France, here is an admirable adventure. We will fill our carriage with pistols, blunderbusses, and double-barreled guns. Luigi Vampa comes to take us, and we take him. We bring him back to Rome, and present him to His Holiness the Pope, who asks how he can repay so great a service. Then we merely ask for a carriage and a pair of horses, and we see the carnival in the carriage, and doubtless the Roman people will crown us at the Capitol, and proclaim us, like Curtius and the veiled Horatius, the preservers of their country. Whilst Albert proposed this scheme, Signor Pastrini's face assumed an expression impossible to describe. And pray, asked France, where are these pistols, blunderbusses, and other deadly weapons with which you intend filling the carriage? Not out of my armory, for at Terracina I was plundered evening of my hunting knife. I shared the same fate at Aquapendente. Do you know, Signor Pastrini, said Albert, lighting a second cigar at the first, that this practice is very convenient for bandits, and that it seems to be due to an arrangement of their own. Doubtless Signor Pastrini found this pleasantry compromising, for he only answered half the question, and then he spoke to France as the only one likely to listen with attention. Your Excellency knows that it is not customary to defend yourself when attacked by bandits. What? Cried Albert, whose courage revolted at the idea of being plundered tamely, not make any resistance. No, for it would be useless. What could you do against a dozen bandits, who spring out of some pit, ruin, or aqueduct, and level their pieces at you? Parbleu, they should kill me. The innkeeper turned to France with an air that seemed to say, your friend is decidedly mad. My dear Albert, returned France, your answer is sublime and worthy. The let him die of Corneille only. When Horace made that answer, the safety of Rome was concerned. But, as for us, it is only to gratify a whim, and it would be ridiculous to risk our lives for so foolish a motive. Albert poured himself out a glass of Lacrima Christi, which he sipped at intervals, muttering some unintelligible words. Well, Signor Pastrini, said France, now that my companion is quieted, and you have seen how peaceful my intentions are, tell me who is this Luigi Vampa? Is he a shepherd or a nobleman? Young or old? Tall or short? Describe him, in order that, if we meet him by chance, like Bugaboo John or Lara, we may recognize him. You could not apply to any one better able to inform you on all these points, for I knew him when he was a child, and one day that I fell into his hands, going from Ferentino to Alatri, he, fortunately for me, recollected me, and set me free, not only without ransom, but made me a present of a very splendid watch, and related his history to me. Let us see the watch, said Albert. Signor Pastrini drew from his fob a magnificent breget, bearing the name of its maker, of Persian manufacture, and a count's coronet. Here it is, said he. Pest, returned Albert, I compliment you on it. I have it, fellow. He took his watch from his waistcoat pocket, and it cost me 30 francs. Let us hear the history, said France, motioning Signor Pastrini to seat himself. Your Excellencies permit it? Asked the host. Hardiho, cried Albert, you are not a preacher, to remain standing. The host sat down, after having made each of them a respectful bow, which meant that he was ready to tell them all they wished to know concerning Luigi Vampa. You tell me, said France, at the moment Signor Pastrini was about to open his mouth, that you knew Luigi Vampa when he was a child. He is still a young man, then? A young man? He is only 22. He will gain himself a reputation. What do you think of that, Albert? At 22 to be thus famous? Yes, and at his age, Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon, who have all made some noise in the world, were quite behind him. So, continued France, the hero of this history is only 22, scarcely so much. Is he tall or short? Of the middle height, about the same stature as his excellency, returned the host, pointing to Albert. Thanks for the comparison, said Albert, with a bow. Go on, Signor Pastrini, continued France, smiling at his friend's susceptibility. To what class of society does he belong? He was a shepherd boy attached to the farm of the Count of San Felice, situated between Palestrina and the Lake of Gabri. He was born at Pampinara and entered the Count's service when he was 5 years old. His father was also a shepherd who owned a small flock and lived by the wool and the milk, which he sold at Rome. When quite a child, the little Vampa displayed a most extraordinary precocity. One day, when he was 7 years old, he came to the curate of Palestrina and asked to be taught to read. It was somewhat difficult, for he could not quit his flock, but the good curate went every day to say mass at a little hamlet, too poor to pay a priest, and which, having no other name, was called Borgo. He told Luigi that he may meet him on his return, and that then he would give him a lesson, warning him that it would be short, and that he must profit as much as possible by it. The child accepted joyfully. Every day Luigi led his flock to graze on the road that leads from Palestrina to Borgo. Every day, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the priest and the boy sat down on a bank by the wayside, and the little shepherd took his lesson out of the priest's breviary. At the end of 3 months he had learned to read. This was not enough. He must now learn to write. The priest had a writing teacher at Rome make 3 alphabets, one large, one middling, and one small, and pointed out to him that by the help of a sharp instrument he could trace the letters on a slate, and thus learn to write. The same evening, when the flock was safe at the farm, the little Luigi hastened to the smith at Palestrina, took a large nail, heated and sharpened it, and formed a sort of stylus. The next morning he gathered an armful of pieces of slate and began. At the end of 3 months he had learned to write. The curate, astonished at his quickness and intelligence, made him a present of pens, paper, and a penknife. This demanded new effort, but nothing compared to the first. At the end of a week he wrote as well with this pen as with the stylus. The curate related the incident to the Count of San Felice, who sent for the little shepherd, made him read and write before him, ordered his attendant to let him eat with the domestics, and to give him 2 piasters a month. With this, Luigi purchased books and pencils. He applied his imitative powers to everything, and, like Giotto, when young, he drew on his slate sheep, houses, and trees. Then, with his knife, he began to carve all sorts of objects in wood. It was thus that Pinelli, the famous sculptor, had commenced. A girl of 6 or 7, that is a little younger than Vampa, tended sheep on a farm near Palestrina. She was an orphan, born at Valmontone, and was named Teresa. The 2 children met, sat down near each other, let their flocks mingle together, played, laughed, and conversed together. In the evening they separated the Count of San Felice's flock from those of Baron Cervetri, and the children returned to their respective farms, promising to meet the next morning. The next day they kept their word, and thus they grew up together. Vampa was 12, and Teresa 11, and yet their natural disposition revealed itself. Beside his taste for the fine arts, which Luigi had carried as far as he could in his solitude, he was given to alternating fits of sadness and enthusiasm, was often angry and capricious, and always sarcastic. None of the lads of Pampinara, Palestrina, or Valmontone had been able to gain any influence over him or even to become his companion. His disposition, always inclined to exact concessions rather than to make them, kept him aloof from all friendships. Teresa alone ruled by a look, a word, a gesture. This impetuous character, which yielded beneath the hand of a woman, and which beneath the hand of a man may have broken, but could never have been bended. Teresa was lively and gay, but coquettish to excess. the 2 piasters that Luigi received every month from the Count of San Felis's steward, and the price of all the little carvings in wood he sold at Rome, were expended in earrings, necklaces, and gold hairpins, so that, thanks to her friend's generosity, Teresa was the most beautiful and the best attired peasant near Rome. The 2 children grew up together, passing all their time with each other and giving themselves up to the wild ideas of their different characters. Thus, in all their dreams, their wishes, and their conversations, Vampa saw himself the captain of a vessel, general of an army, or governor of a province. Teresa saw herself rich, superbly attired, and attended by a train of liveried domestics. Then, when they had thus passed the day in building castles in the air, they separated their flocks and descended from the elevation of their dreams to the reality of their humble position. One day the young shepherd told the count's steward that he had seen a wolf come out of the Sabine mountains and prowl around his flock. The steward gave him a gun. This was what Vampa longed for. This gun had an excellent barrel made at Brescia and carrying a ball with the precision of an English rifle, but one day the count broke the stock and had then cast the gun aside. This, however, was nothing to a sculptor like Vampa. He examined the broken stock, calculated what change it would require to adapt the gun to his shoulder, and made a fresh stock, so beautifully carved that it would have fetched 15 or 20 piasters had he chosen to sell it. But nothing could be farther from his thoughts. For a long time a gun had been the young man's greatest ambition. In every country where independence has taken the place of liberty, the first desire of a manly heart is to possess a weapon which at once renders him capable of defense or attack, and, by rendering its owner terrible, often makes him feared. From this moment, Vampa devoted all his leisure time to perfecting himself in the use of his precious weapon. He purchased powder and ball, and everything served him for a mark, the trunk of some old and moss-grown olive tree that grew on the Sabine mountains, the fox, as he quitted his earth on some marauding excursion, the eagle that soared above their heads, and thus he soon became so expert that Teresa overcame the terror she at first felt at the report, and amused herself by watching him direct the ball wherever he pleased, with as much accuracy as if he placed it by hand. One evening a wolf emerged from a pine wood near which they were usually stationed, but the wolf had scarcely advanced 10 yards before he was dead. Proud of this exploit, Vampa took the dead animal on his shoulders and carried him to the farm. These exploits had gained Luigi considerable reputation. The man of superior abilities always finds admirers, go where he will. He was spoken of as the most adroit, the strongest, and the most courageous contadino for 10 leagues around, and although Teresa was universally allowed to be the most beautiful girl of the Sabines, no one had ever spoken to her of love, because it was known that she was beloved by Vampa, and yet the 2 young people had never declared their affection. They had grown together like 2 trees whose roots are mingled, whose branches intertwined, and whose intermingled perfume rises to the heavens. Only their wish to see each other had become a necessity, and they would have preferred death to a day's separation. Teresa was 16 and Vampa 17. About this time, a band of brigands that had established itself in the Lapini Mountains began to be much spoken of. The brigands have never been really extirpated from the neighborhood of Rome. Sometimes a chief is wanted, but when a chief presents himself he rarely has to wait long for a band of followers. The celebrated Cucumetto, pursued in the Abruzzo, driven out of the kingdom of Naples, where he had carried on a regular war, had crossed the Garigliano, like Manfred, and had taken refuge on the banks of the Amasine between Sanino and Juperno. He strove to collect a band of followers, and followed the footsteps of Decisarus and Gasparone, whom he hoped to surpass. Many young men of Palestrina, Frascati, and Pampinara had disappeared. Their disappearance at first caused much disquietude, but it was soon known that they had joined QQ Meadow. After some time, QQ Meadow became the object of universal attention. The most extraordinary traits of ferocious daring and brutality were related of him. One day he carried off a young girl, the daughter of a surveyor of Frosinone. The bandits' laws are positive. A young girl belongs first to him who carries her off, then the rest draw lots for her, and she is abandoned to their brutality until death relieves her sufferings. When their parents are sufficiently rich to pay a ransom, a messenger is sent to negotiate. The prisoner is hostage for the security of the messenger. Should the ransom be refused, the prisoner is irrevocably lost. The young girl's lover was in QQ Meadow's troop. His name was Carlini. When she recognized her lover, the poor girl extended her arms to him and believed herself safe. But Carlini felt his heart sink, for he but too well knew the fate that awaited her. However, as he was a favorite with QQ Meadow, as he had for 3 years faithfully served him, and as he had saved his life by shooting a dragoon who was about to cut him down, he hoped the chief would have pity on him. He took QQ Meadow one side, while the young girl, seated at the foot of a huge pine that stood in the center of the forest, made a veil of her picturesque headdress to hide her face from the lascivious gaze of the bandits. There he told the chief all his affection for the prisoner, their promises of mutual fidelity, and how every night, since he had been near, they had met in some neighboring ruins. It so happened that night that QQ Meadow had sent Carlini to a village, so that he had been unable to go to the place of meeting. QQ Meadow had been there, however, by accident, as he said, and had carried the maiden off. Carlini besought his chief to make an exception in Rita's favor, as her father was rich and could pay a large ransom. QQ Meadow seemed to yield to his friend's entreaties and bade him find a shepherd to send to Rita's father at Frosinone. Carlini flew joyfully to Rita, telling her she was saved, and bidding her write to her father to inform him what had occurred, and that her ransom was fixed at 300 piasters. 12 hours' delay was all that was granted, that is, until 9 the next morning. The instant the letter was written, Carlini seized it and hastened to the plain to find a messenger. He found a young shepherd watching his flock. The natural messengers of the bandits are the shepherds who live between the city and the mountains, between civilized and savage life. The boy undertook the commission, promising to be in Frosinone in less than an hour. Carlini returned, anxious to see his mistress and announce the joyful intelligence. He found the troop in the glade, supping off the provisions exacted as contributions from the peasants, but his eye vainly sought Rita and QQ Meadow among them. He inquired where they were, and was answered by a burst of laughter. A cold perspiration burst from every pore, and his hair stood on end. He repeated his question. One of the bandits rose and offered him a glass filled with Orvieto, saying, "To the health of the brave QQ Meadow and the fair Rita." At this moment Carlini heard a woman's cry. He divined the truth, seized the glass, broke it across the face of him who presented it, and rushed towards the spot from where the cry came. After 100 yards he turned the corner of the thicket. He found Rita, senseless in the arms of QQ Meadow. At the sight of Carlini, QQ Meadow rose, a pistol in each hand. The two brigands looked at each other for a moment, the one with a smile of lasciviousness on his lips, the other with the pallor of death on his brow. A terrible battle between the two men seemed imminent, but by degrees Carlini's features relaxed. His hand, which had grasped one of the pistols in his belt, fell to his side. Rita lay between them. The moon lighted the group. "Well," said QQ Meadow, "have you executed your commission?" "Yes, Captain," returned Carlini. "At 9 o'clock tomorrow Rita's father will be here with the money. It is well. In the meantime, we will have a merry night. This young girl is charming and does credit to your taste. Now, as I am not egotistical, we will return to our comrades, and draw lots for her. You have determined, then, to abandon her to the common law, said Carlini. Why should an exception be made in her favor? I thought that my entreaties, what right have you, any more than the rest, to ask for an exception? It is true, but never mind, continued Cucumetto, laughing. Sooner or later your turn will come. Carlina's teeth clinched convulsively. Now, then, said Cucumetto, advancing towards the other bandits, are you coming? I follow you. Cucumetto departed, without losing sight of Carlini, for, doubtless, he feared lest he should strike him unawares. But nothing betrayed a hostile design on Carlina's part. He was standing, his arms folded, near Rita, who was still insensible. Cucumetto fancied for a moment the young man was about to take her in his arms and fly. But this mattered little. To him now Rita had been his, and as for the money, 300 piasters distributed among the band was so small a sum that he cared little about it. He continued to follow the path to the glade, but, to his great surprise, Carlini arrived almost as soon as himself. Let us draw lots. Let us draw lots, cried all the brigands when they saw the chief. Their demand was fair, and the chief inclined his head in sign of acquiescence. The eyes of all shone fiercely as they made their demand, and the red light of the fire made them look like demons. The names of all, including Carlini, were placed in a hat, and the youngest of the band drew forth a ticket. The ticket bore the name of Diavolaxo. He was the man who had proposed to Carlini the health of their chief, and to whom Carlini replied by breaking the glass across his face. A large wound, extending from the temple to the mouth, was bleeding profusely. Diavolaxo, seeing himself thus favored by fortune, burst into a loud laugh. Captain, said he, just now Carlini would not drink your health when I proposed it to him. Propose mine to him, and let us see if he will be more condescending to you than to me. Every one expected an explosion on Carlina's part, but to their great surprise he took a glass in one hand and a flask in the other, and filling it, your health, Diavolaxo, said he calmly, and he drank it off, without his hand trembling in the least. Then sitting down by the fire, my supper, said he, my expedition has given me an appetite. Well done, Carlini, cried the brigands. That is acting like a good fellow, and they all formed a circle round the fire, while Diavolaxo disappeared. Carlini ate and drank as if nothing had happened. The bandits looked on with astonishment at this singular conduct until they heard footsteps. They turned round and saw Diavolaxo bearing the young girl in his arms. Her head hung back, and her long hair swept the ground. As they entered the circle, the bandits could perceive, by the firelight, the unearthly pallor of the young girl and of Diavolaxo. This apparition was so strange and so solemn that every one rose, with the exception of Carlini, who remained seated and ate and drank calmly. Diavolaxo advanced amidst the most profound silence and laid Rita at the captain's feet. Then every one could understand the cause of the unearthly pallor in the young girl and the bandit. A knife was plunged up to the hilt in Rita's left breast. Every one looked at Carlini. The sheath at his belt was empty. Ah, said the chief, I now understand why Carlini stayed behind. All savage natures appreciate a desperate deed. No other of the bandits would, perhaps, have done the same, but they all understood what Carlini had done. Now, then, cried Carlini, rising in his turn and approaching the corpse, his hand on the butt of one of his pistols. Does any one dispute the possession of this woman with me? No, returned the chief, she is yours. Carlini raised her in his arms and carried her out of the circle of firelight. Cucumetto placed his sentinels for the night, and the bandits wrapped themselves in their cloaks and lay down before the fire. At midnight, the sentinel gave the alarm, and in an instant all were on the alert. It was Rita's father, who brought his daughter's ransom in person. Here, said he to Cucumetto, here are 300 piasters. Give me back my child. But the chief, without taking the money, made a sign to him to follow. The old man obeyed. They both advanced beneath the trees, through whose branches streamed the moonlight. Cucumetto stopped at last and pointed to two persons grouped at the foot of a tree. There, said he, demand your child of Carlini. He will tell you what has become of her. And he returned to his companions. The old man remained motionless. He felt that some great and unforeseen misfortune hung over his head. At length he advanced toward the group, the meaning of which he could not comprehend. As he approached, Carlini raised his head, and the forms of two persons became visible to the old man's eyes. A woman lay on the ground, her head resting on the knees of a man who was seated by her. As he raised his head, the woman's face became visible. The old man recognized his child, and Carlini recognized the old man. I expected you, said the bandit to Rita's father. Wretch, returned the old man, what have you done? And he gazed with terror on Rita, pale and bloody, a knife buried in her bosom. A ray of moonlight poured through the trees and lighted up the face of the dead. Cucumetto had violated your daughter, said the bandit. I loved her, therefore I slew her, for she would have served as the sport of the whole band. The old man spoke not and grew pale as death. Now, continued Carlini, if I have done wrongly, avenge her. And withdrawing the knife from the wound in Rita's bosom, he held it out to the old man with one hand, while with the other he tore open his vest. You have done well, returned the old man in a hoarse voice. Embrace me, my son. Carlini threw himself, sobbing like a child, into the arms of his mistress's father. These were the first tears the man of blood had ever wept. Now, said the old man, aid me to bury my child. Carlini fetched two pickaxes, and the father and the lover began to dig at the foot of a huge oak, beneath which the young girl was to repose. When the grave was formed, the father kissed her first, and then the lover. Afterwards, one taking the head, the other the feet, they placed her in the grave. Then they knelt on each side of the grave and said the prayers of the dead. Then, when they had finished, they cast the earth over the corpse until the grave was filled. Then, extending his hand, the old man said, I thank you, my son, and now leave me alone. Yet, replied Carlini, leave me, I command you. Carlini obeyed, rejoined his comrades, folded himself in his cloak, and soon appeared to sleep as soundly as the rest. It had been resolved the night before to change their encampment. An hour before daybreak, Cucumetto aroused his men and gave the word to march. But Carlini would not quit the forest without knowing what had become of Rita's father. He went toward the place where he had left him. He found the old man suspended from one of the branches of the oak which shaded his daughter's grave. He then took an oath of bitter vengeance over the dead body of the one and the tomb of the other. But he was unable to complete this oath, for 2 days afterwards, in an encounter with the Roman carbineers, Carlini was killed. There was some surprise, however, that, as he was with his face to the enemy, he should have received a ball between his shoulders. That astonishment ceased when one of the brigands remarked to his comrades that Cucumetto was stationed 10 paces in Carlini's rear when he fell. On the morning of the departure from the forest of Frosinone he had followed Carlini in the darkness, and heard this oath of vengeance, and, like a wise man, anticipated it. They told 10 other stories of this bandit chief, each more singular than the other. Thus, from Fondi to Perugia, every one trembles at the name of Cucumetto. These narratives were frequently the theme of conversation between Luigi and Teresa. The young girl trembled very much at hearing the stories, but Vamper reassured her with a smile, tapping the butt of his good fowling piece which threw its ball so well, and if that did not restore her courage, he pointed to a crow perched on some dead branch, took aim, touched the trigger, and the bird fell dead at the foot of the tree. Time passed on, and the two young people had agreed to be married when Vampa should be 20 and Teresa 19 years of age. They were both orphans and had only their employer's leave to ask, which had been already sought and obtained. One day, when they were talking over their plans for the future, they heard 2 or 3 reports of firearms, and then suddenly a man came out of the wood, near which the 2 young persons used to graze their flocks, and hurried towards them. When he came within hearing, he exclaimed, "I am pursued. Can you conceal me?" They knew full well that this fugitive must be the bandit, but there is an innate sympathy between the Roman brigand and the Roman peasant, and the latter is always ready to aid the former. Vampa, without saying a word, hastened to the stone that closed up the entrance to their grotto, drew it away, made a sign to the fugitive to take refuge there, in a retreat unknown to every one, closed the stone upon him, and then went and resumed his seat by Teresa. Instantly afterwards 4 carbineers, on horseback, appeared on the edge of the wood. 3 of them appeared to be looking for the fugitive, while the 4th dragged a brigand prisoner by the neck. The 3 carbineers looked about carefully on every side, saw the young peasants, and galloping up, began to question them. They had seen no one. "That is very annoying," said the brigadier, "for the man we are looking for is the chief." "Cucumetto," cried Luigi and Teresa at the same moment. "Yes," replied the brigadier, "and as his head is valued at 1,000 Roman crowns, there would have been 500 for you, if you had helped us to catch him." The 2 young persons exchanged looks. The brigadier had a moment's hope. 500 Roman crowns are 3,000 lire, and 3,000 lire are a fortune for 2 poor orphans who are going to be married. "Yes, it is very annoying," said Vampa, "but we have not seen him." Then the carbineers scoured the country in different directions, but in vain. Then, after a time, they disappeared. Vampa then removed the stone, and Cucumetto came out. Through the crevices in the granite he had seen the 2 young peasants talking with the carbineers, and guessed the subject of their parley. He had read in the countenances of Luigi and Teresa their steadfast resolution not to surrender him, and he drew from his pocket a purse full of gold, which he'd offered to them. Vampa raised his head proudly. As to Teresa, her eyes sparkled when she thought of all the fine gowns and gay jewelry she could buy with this purse of gold. Cucumetto was a cunning fiend, and had assumed the form of a brigand instead of a serpent, and this look from Teresa showed to him that she was a worthy daughter of Eve, and he returned to the forest, pausing several times on his way, under the pretext of saluting his protectors. Several days elapsed, and they neither saw nor heard of Cucumetto. The time of the carnival was at hand. The Count of San Felice announced a grand masked ball, to which all that were distinguished in Rome were invited. Teresa had a great desire to see this ball. Luigi asked permission of his protector, the steward, that she and he may be present amongst the servants of the house. This was granted. The ball was given by the Count for the particular pleasure of his daughter, Carmela, whom he adored. Carmela was precisely the age and figure of Teresa, and Teresa was as handsome as Carmela. On the evening of the ball, Teresa was attired in her best, her most brilliant ornaments in her hair, and gayest glass beads. She was in the costume of the women of Frascati. Luigi wore the very picturesque garb of the Roman peasant. At holiday time, they both mingled, as they had leave to do, with the servants and peasants. The festa was magnificent. Not only was the villa brilliantly illuminated, but thousands of colored lanterns were suspended from the trees in the garden, and very soon the palace overflowed to the terraces, and the terraces to the garden walks. At each cross bath was an orchestra and tables spread with refreshments. The guests stopped, formed quadrilles, and danced in any part of the grounds they pleased. Carmela was attired like a woman of Cennino. Her cap was embroidered with pearls, the pins in her hair were of gold and diamonds, her girdle was of Turkey silk, with large embroidered flowers, her bodice and skirt were of cashmere, her apron of Indian muslin, and the buttons of her corset were of jewels. Two of her companions were dressed, the one as a woman of Nettuno, and the other as a woman of Larixia. 4 young men of the richest and noblest families of Rome accompanied them with that Italian freedom which has not its parallel in any other country in the world. They were attired as peasants of Albano, Velletri, Civita Castellana, and Sora. We need hardly add that these peasant costumes, like those of the young women, were brilliant with gold and jewels. Carmela wished to form a quadrille, but there was one lady wanting. Carmela looked all around her, but not one of the guests had a costume similar to her own or those of her companions. The Count of San Felis pointed out Teresa, who was hanging on Luigi's arm in a group of peasants. "Will you allow me, father?" said Carmela. "Certainly," replied the Count. "Are we not in carnival time?" Carmela turned towards the young man who was talking with her, and saying a few words to him, pointed with her finger to Teresa. The young man looked, bowed in obedience, and then went to Teresa and invited her to dance in a quadrille directed by the Count's daughter. Teresa felt a flush pass over her face. She looked at Luigi, who could not refuse his assent. Luigi slowly relinquished Teresa's arm, which he had held beneath his own, and Teresa, accompanied by her elegant cavalier, took her appointed place with much agitation in the aristocratic quadrille. Certainly, in the eyes of an artist, the exact and strict costume of Teresa had a very different character from that of Carmela and her companions, and Teresa was frivolous and coquettish, and thus the embroidery and muslins, the cashmere waist girdles, all dazzled her, and the reflection of sapphires and diamonds almost turned her giddy brain. Luigi felt a sensation hitherto unknown arising in his mind. It was like an acute pain which gnawed at his heart and then thrilled through his whole body. He followed with his eye each movement of Teresa and her cavalier. When their hands touched, he felt as though he should swoon. Every pulse beat with violence, and it seemed as though a bell were ringing in his ears. When they spoke, although Teresa listened timidly and with downcast eyes to the conversation of her cavalier, as Luigi could read in the ardent looks of the good-looking young man that his language was that of praise, it seemed as if the whole world was turning round with him, and all the voices of hell were whispering in his ears ideas of murder and assassination. Then, fearing that his paroxysm may get the better of him, he clutched with one hand the branch of a tree against which he was leaning, and with the other convulsively grasped the dagger with a carved handle which was in his belt, and which, unwittingly, he drew from the scabbard from time to time. Luigi was jealous. He felt that, influenced by her ambitions and coquettish disposition, Teresa may escape him. The young peasant girl, at first timid and scared, soon recovered herself. We have said that Teresa was handsome, but this is not all. Teresa was endowed with all those wild graces which are so much more potent than our affected and studied elegancies. She had almost all the honors of the quadrille, and if she were envious of the Count of San Felis's daughter, we will not undertake to say that Carmela was not jealous of her. And with overpowering compliments her handsome cavalier led her back to the place from where he had taken her, and where Luigi awaited her. Twice or thrice during the dance the young girl had glanced at Luigi, and each time she saw that he was pale and that his features were agitated. Once evening the blade of his knife, half drawn from its sheath, had dazzled her eyes with its sinister glare. Thus it was almost tremblingly that she resumed her lover's arm. The quadrille had been most perfect, and it was evident there was a great demand for a repetition, Carmela alone objecting to it. But the Count of San Felis besought his daughter so earnestly that she acceded. One of the cavaliers then hastened to invite Teresa, without whom it was impossible for the quadrille to be formed, but the young girl had disappeared. The truth was that Luigi had not felt the strength to support another such trial, and half by persuasion and half by force he had removed Teresa toward another part of the garden. Teresa had yielded in spite of herself, but when she looked at the agitated countenance of the young man, she understood by his silence and trembling voice that something strange was passing within him. She herself was not exempt from internal emotion, and without having done anything wrong, yet fully comprehended that Luigi was right in reproaching her. Why, she did not know, but yet she did not the less feel that these reproaches were merited. However, to Teresa's great astonishment, Luigi remained mute, and not a word escaped his lips the rest of the evening. When the chill of the night had driven away the guests from the gardens, and the gates of the villa were closed on them for the festa indoors, he took Teresa quite away, and as he left her at her home, he said, "Teresa, what were you thinking of as you danced opposite the young Countess of San Felice?" "I thought," replied the young girl, with all the frankness of her nature, "that I would give half my life for a costume such as she wore." "And what said your cavalier to you?" "He said it only depended on myself to have it, and I had only one word to say." "He was right," said Luigi. "Do you desire it as ardently as you say?" "Yes." "Well, then, you shall have it." The young girl, much astonished, raised her head to look at him, but his face was so gloomy and terrible that her words froze to her lips. As Luigi spoke thus, he left her. Teresa followed him with her eyes into the darkness as long as she could, and when he had quite disappeared, she went into the house with a sigh. That night a memorable event occurred, due, no doubt, to the imprudence of some servant who had neglected to extinguish the lights. The villa of San Felice took fire in the rooms adjoining the very apartment of the lovely Carmela. Awakened in the night by the light of the flames, she sprang out of bed, wrapped herself in a dressing gown, and attempted to escape by the door. But the corridor by which she hoped to fly was already a prey to the flames. She then returned to her room, calling for help as loudly as she could, when suddenly her window, which was 20 feet from the ground, was opened. A young peasant jumped into the chamber, seized her in his arms, and with superhuman skill and strength conveyed her to the turf of the grass plot, where she fainted. When she recovered, her father was by her side. All the servants surrounded her, offering her assistance. An entire wing of the villa was burnt down, but what of that as long as Carmela was safe and uninjured? Her preserver was everywhere sought for, but he did not appear. He was inquired after, but no one had seen him. Carmela was greatly troubled that she had not recognized him, as the Count was immensely rich, accepting the danger Carmela had run, and the marvelous manner in which she had escaped made that appear to him rather a favor of Providence than a real misfortune. The loss occasioned by the conflagration was to him but a trifle. The next day, at the usual hour, the two young peasants were on the borders of the forest. Luigi arrived first. He came toward Teresa in high spirits, and seemed to have completely forgotten the events of the previous evening. The young girl was very pensive, but seeing Luigi so cheerful, she on her part assumed a smiling air, which was natural to her when she was not excited or in a passion. Luigi took her arm beneath his own and led her to the door of the grotto. Then he paused. The young girl, perceiving that there was something extraordinary, looked at him steadfastly. "Teresa," said Luigi, "yesterday evening you told me you would give all the world to have a costume similar to that of the Count's daughter." "Yes," replied Teresa with astonishment, "but I was mad to utter such a wish." And I replied, "Very well, you shall have it." "Yes," replied the young girl, whose astonishment increased at every word uttered by Luigi. "But of course your reply was only to please me. I have promised no more than I have given you." "Teresa," said Luigi proudly, "go into the grotto and dress yourself." At these words he drew away the stone and showed Teresa the grotto, lighted up by two wax lights, which burnt on each side of a splendid mirror. On a rustic table made by Luigi were spread out the pearl necklace and the diamond pins, and on a chair at the side was laid the rest of the costume. Teresa uttered a cry of joy, and, without inquiring from where this attire came, or evening thanking Luigi, darted into the grotto, transformed into a dressing room. Luigi pushed the stone behind her, for on the crest of a small adjacent hill which cut off the view toward Palestrina, he saw a traveler on horseback, stopping a moment, as if uncertain of his road, and thus presenting against the blue sky that perfect outline which is peculiar to distant objects in southern climes. When he saw Luigi, he put his horse into a gallop, and advanced toward him. Luigi was not mistaken. The traveler, who was going from Palestrina to Tivoli, had mistaken his way. The young man directed him, but as at a distance of a quarter of a mile the road again divided into three ways, and on reaching these the traveler may again stray from his route. He begged Luigi to be his guide. Luigi threw his cloak on the ground, placed his carbine on his shoulder, and freed from his heavy covering, proceeded. The traveler, with the rapid step of a mountaineer, which a horse can scarcely keep up with. In 10 minutes Luigi and the traveler reached the crossroads. On arriving there, with an air as majestic as that of an emperor, he stretched his hand towards that one of the roads which the traveler was to follow. "That is your road, Excellency, and now you cannot again mistake. And here is your recompense," said the traveler, offering the young herdsman some small pieces of money. "Thank you," said Luigi, drawing back his hand. "I render a service. I do not sell it." "Well," replied the traveler, who seemed used to this difference between the servility of a man of the cities and the pride of the mountaineer, "if you refuse wages, you will, perhaps, accept a gift." "Ah, yes, that is another thing." "Then," said the traveler, "take these 2 Venetian sequins and give them to your bride, to make herself a pair of earrings. And then do you take this poniard," said the young herdsman. "You will not find one better carved between Albano and Civita Castellana." "I accept it," answered the traveler, "but then the obligation will be on my side, for this poniard is worth more than 2 sequins. For a dealer perhaps, but for me, who engraved it myself, it is hardly worth a piaster." "What is your name?" inquired the traveler. "Luigi Vampa," replied the shepherd, with the same air as he would have replied, "Alexander, King of Macedon." "And yours?" "I," said the traveler, "am called Sinbad the Sailor." France d'Epinay started with surprise. "Sinbad the Sailor," he said. "Yes," replied the narrator, "that was the name which the traveler gave to Vampa as his own." "Well, and what may you have to say against this name?" inquired Albert. "It is a very pretty name, and the adventures of the gentleman of that name amused me very much in my youth, I must confess." France said no more. The name of Sinbad the Sailor, as may well be supposed, awakened in him a world of recollections, as had the name of the Count of Monte Cristo on the previous evening. "Proceed," said he to the host. Vampa put the 2 sequins haughtily into his pocket, and slowly returned by the way he had gone. As he came within 200 or 300 paces of the grotto, he thought he heard a cry. He listened to know from where this sound could proceed. A moment afterwards he thought he heard his own name pronounced distinctly. The cry proceeded from the grotto. He bounded like a chamois, cocking his carbine as he went, and in a moment reached the summit of a hill opposite to that on which he had perceived the traveler. 3 cries for help came more distinctly to his ear. He cast his eyes around him and saw a man carrying off Teresa, as Nessus, the centaur, carried Deianira. This man, who was hastening towards the wood, was already 3/4 of the way on the road from the grotto to the forest. Vampa measured the distance. The man was at least 200 paces in advance of him, and there was not a chance of overtaking him. The young shepherd stopped, as if his feet had been rooted to the ground. Then he put the butt of his carbine to his shoulder, took aim at the ravisher, followed him for a second in his track, and then fired. The ravisher stopped suddenly, his knees bent under him, and he fell with Teresa in his arms. The young girl rose instantly, but the man lay on the earth struggling in the agonies of death. Vampa then rushed towards Teresa, for at 10 paces from the dying man her legs had failed her, and she had dropped on her knees, so that the young man feared that the ball that had brought down his enemy had also wounded his betrothed. Fortunately, she was unscathed, and it was fright alone that had overcome Teresa. When Luigi had assured himself that she was safe and unharmed, he turned towards the wounded man. He had just expired, with clenched hands, his mouth in a spasm of agony, and his hair on end in the sweat of death. His eyes remained open and menacing. Vampa approached the corpse and recognized Q Meadow. From the day on which the bandit had been saved by the 2 young peasants, he had been enamored of Teresa and had sworn she should be his. From that time he had watched them, and profiting by the moment when her lover had left her alone, had carried her off, and believed he at length had her in his power, when the ball, directed by the unerring skill of the young herdsman, had pierced his heart. Vampa gazed on him for a moment, without betraying the slightest emotion, while, on the contrary, Teresa, shuddering in every limb, dared not approach the slain ruffian, but by degrees, and threw a hesitating glance at the dead body over the shoulder of her lover. Suddenly Vampa turned toward his mistress. "Ah," said he, "good, good, you are dressed. It is now my turn to dress myself." Teresa was clothed from head to foot in the garb of the Count of San Felic's daughter. Vampa took Q Meadow's body in his arms and conveyed it to the grotto, while in her turn Teresa remained outside. If a second traveler had passed, he would have seen a strange thing, a shepherdess watching her flock, clad in a cashmere gown, with earrings and necklace of pearls, diamond pins, and buttons of sapphires, emeralds, and rubies. He would, no doubt, have believed that he had returned to the times of Florian, and would have declared, on reaching Paris, that he had met an Alpine shepherdess seated at the foot of the Sabine hill. At the end of a quarter of an hour Vampa quitted the grotto. His costume was no less elegant than that of Teresa. He wore a vest of garnet-colored velvet, with buttons of cut gold, a silk waistcoat covered with embroidery, a Roman scarf tied round his neck, a cartridge box worked with gold and red and green silk, sky blue velvet, breeches fastened above the knee with diamond buckles, garters of deerskin worked with 1,000 arabesques, and a hat whereon hung ribbons of all colors. 2 watches hung from his girdle, and a splendid poniard was in his belt. Teresa uttered a cry of admiration. Vampa in this attire resembled a painting by Leopold Robert or Schnetz. He had assumed the entire costume of Q Meadow. The young man saw the effect produced on his betrothed, and a smile of pride passed over his lips. "Now," he said to Teresa, "are you ready to share my fortune, whatever it may be?" "Oh, yes," exclaimed the young girl enthusiastically, "and follow me wherever I go, to the world's end. Then take my arm, and let us on. We have no time to lose." The young girl did so without questioning her lover as to where he was conducting her, for he appeared to her at this moment as handsome, proud, and powerful as a god. They went towards the forest and soon entered it. We need scarcely say that all the paths of the mountain were known to Vampa. He therefore went forward without a moment's hesitation, although there was no beaten track, but he knew his path by looking at the trees and bushes, and thus they kept on advancing for nearly an hour and a half. At the end of this time they had reached the thickest of the forest. A torrent, whose bed was dry, led into a deep gorge. Vampa took this wild road, which, enclosed between 2 ridges and shadowed by the tufted umbrage of the pines, seemed, but for the difficulties of its descent, that path to Avernus of which Virgil speaks. Teresa had become alarmed at the wild and deserted look of the plain around her, and pressed closely against her guide, not uttering a syllable, but as she saw him advance with evening step and composed countenance, she endeavored to repress her emotion. Suddenly, about 10 paces from them, a man advanced from behind a tree and aimed at Vampa. "Not another step," he said, "or you are a dead man." "What, then?" said Vampa, raising his hand with a gesture of disdain, while Teresa, no longer able to restrain her alarm, clung closely to him. "Do wolves rend each other?" "Who are you?" inquired the sentinel. "I am Luigi Vampa, shepherd of the San Felice farm. What do you want?" "I would speak with your companions who are in the glade at Rocca Bianca." "Follow me, then," said the sentinel, "or, as you know your way, go first." Vampa smiled disdainfully at this precaution on the part of the bandit, went before Teresa, and continued to advance with the same firm and easy step as before. At the end of 10 minutes the bandit made them a sign to stop. The two young persons obeyed. Then the bandit thrice imitated the cry of a crow. A croak answered this signal. "Good," said the sentry. "You may now go on." Luigi and Teresa again set forward. As they went on, Teresa clung tremblingly to her lover at the sight of weapons and a glistening of carbines through the trees. The retreat of Rocca Bianca was at the top of a small mountain, which no doubt in former days had been a volcano, an extinct volcano before the days when Remus and Romulus had deserted Alba to come and found the city of Rome. Teresa and Luigi reached the summit, and all at once found themselves in the presence of 20 bandits. "Here is a young man who seeks and wishes to speak to you," said the sentinel. "What has he to say?" inquired the young man who was in command in the chief's absence. "I wish to say that I am tired of a shepherd's life," was Vampa's reply. "Ah, I understand," said the lieutenant, "and you seek admittance into our ranks?" "Welcome," cried several bandits from Ferrucino, Pampinara, and Anagni, who had recognized Luigi Vampa. "Yes, but I came to ask something more than to be your companion." "And what may that be?" inquired the bandits with astonishment. "I come to ask to be your captain," said the young man. The bandits shouted with laughter. "And what have you done to aspire to this honor?" demanded the lieutenant. "I have killed your chief, Cucumetto, whose dress I now wear, and I set fire to the Villa San Felice to procure a wedding dress for my betrothed." An hour afterwards Luigi Vampa was chosen captain, Vice Cucumetto deceased. "Well, my dear Albert," said Franz, turning towards his friend, "what think you of citizen Luigi Vampa?" "I say he is a myth," replied Albert, "and never had an existence." "And what may a myth be?" inquired Pastrini. "The explanation would be too long, my dear landlord," replied Franz. "And you say that Signor Vampa exercises his profession at this moment in the environs of Rome, and with a boldness of which no bandit before him ever gave an example. Then the police have vainly tried to lay hands on him. Why, you see, he has a good understanding with the shepherds in the plains, the fishermen of the Tiber, and the smugglers of the coast. They seek for him in the mountains, and he is on the waters. They follow him on the waters, and he is on the open sea. Then they pursue him, and he has suddenly taken refuge in the islands at Giglio, Guanari, or Monte Cristo, and when they hunt for him there, he reappears suddenly at Albano, Tivoli, or Larixia. And how does he behave towards travelers? Alas, his plan is very simple. It depends on the distance he may be from the city, whether he gives 8 hours, 12 hours, or a day, where to pay their ransom, and when that time has elapsed he allows another hour's grace. At the 60th minute of this hour, if the money is not forthcoming, he blows out the prisoner's brains with a pistol shot, or plants his dagger in his heart, and that settles the count. "Well, Albert," inquired Franz of his companion, "are you still disposed to go to the Colosseum by the outer wall?" Quite so, said Albert, if the way be picturesque. The clock struck 9 as the door opened and a coachman appeared. Excellencies, said he, the coach is ready. Well, then, said France, let us to the Colosseum. By the Porta del Popolo or by the streets, your excellencies? By the streets, morbleu, by the streets, cried France. Chapter 34. The Colosseum. France had so managed his route that during the ride to the Colosseum, they passed not a single ancient ruin, so that no preliminary impression interfered to mitigate the colossal proportions of the gigantic building they came to admire. The road selected was a continuation of the Via Sistina. Then by cutting off the right angle of the street in which stands Santa Maria Maggiore, and proceeding by the Via Urbana and San Pietro in Vincoli, the travelers would find themselves directly opposite the Colosseum. This itinerary possessed another great advantage, that of leaving France at full liberty to indulge his deep reverie upon the subject of Signor Pastrini's story, in which his mysterious host of Monte Cristo was so strangely mixed up. Seated with folded arms in a corner of the carriage, he continued to ponder over the singular history he had so lately listened to, and to ask himself an interminable number of questions touching its various circumstances, without, however, arriving at a satisfactory reply to any of them. One fact more than the rest brought his friend, Sinbad the sailor, back to his recollection, and that was the mysterious sort of intimacy that seemed to exist between the brigands and the sailors, and Pastrini's account of Vamp as having found refuge on board the vessels of smugglers and fishermen reminded France of the 2 Corsican bandits he had found supping so amicably with the crew of the little yacht which had evening deviated from its course and touched at Porto Vecchio for the sole purpose of landing them. The very name assumed by his host of Monte Cristo and again repeated by the landlord of the Hotel de Londres abundantly proved to him that his island friend was playing his philanthropic part on the shores of Piombino, Civita Vecchio, Ostia, and Gaeta, as on those of Corsica, Tuscany, and Spain, and further, France. Bethought him of having heard his singular entertainer speak both of Tunis and Palermo, proving by that how largely his circle of acquaintances extended. But however the mind of the young man may be absorbed in these reflections, they were at once dispersed at the sight of the dark, frowning ruins of the stupendous Colosseum, through the various openings of which the pale moonlight played and flickered like the unearthly gleam from the eyes of the wandering dead. The carriage stopped near the Meta-Sudans. The door was opened, and the young men, eagerly alighting, found themselves opposite a cicerone who appeared to have sprung up from the ground, so unexpected was his appearance. The usual guide from the hotel having followed them, they had paid 2 conductors, nor is it possible, at Rome, to avoid this abundant supply of guides, besides the ordinary cicerone, who seizes upon you directly you set foot in your hotel, and never quits you while you remain in the city. There is also a special cicerone belonging to each monument, no, almost to each part of a monument. It may, therefore, be easily imagined there is no scarcity of guides at the Colosseum, that wonder of all ages, which Martial thus eulogizes. Let Memphis cease to boast the barbarous miracles of her pyramids, and the wonders of Babylon be talked of no more among us. All must bow to the superiority of the gigantic labor of the Caesars, and the many voices of fame spread far and wide the surpassing merits of this incomparable monument. As for Albert and France, they essayed not to escape from their Ciceronian tyrants, and, truly, it would have been so much the more difficult to break their bondage, as the guides alone are permitted to visit these monuments with torches in their hands. Thus, then, the young men made no attempt at resistance, but blindly and confidingly surrendered themselves into the care and custody of their conductors. Albert had already made 7 or 8 similar excursions to the Colosseum, while his less favored companion trod for the first time in his life the classic ground forming the monument of Flavius Vespasian. And, to his credit be it spoken, his mind, evening amid the glib loquacity of the guides, was duly and deeply touched with awe and enthusiastic admiration of all he saw, and certainly no adequate notion of these stupendous ruins can be formed save by such as have visited them, and more especially by moonlight, at which time the vast proportions of the building appear twice as large when viewed by the mysterious beams of a southern moonlit sky, whose rays are sufficiently clear and vivid to light the horizon with a glow equal to the soft twilight of an eastern clime. Scarcely, therefore, had the reflective France walked 100 steps beneath the interior porticos of the ruin, than, abandoning Albert to the guides who would by no means yield their prescriptive right of carrying their victims through the routine regularly laid down, and as regularly followed by them, but dragged the unconscious visitor to the various objects with a pertinacity that admitted of no appeal, beginning, as a matter of course, with the lion's den and finishing with Caesar's podium, to escape a jargon and mechanical survey of the wonders by which he was surrounded. France ascended a half-dilapidated staircase, and, leaving them to follow their monotonous round, seated himself at the foot of a column, and immediately opposite a large aperture, which permitted him to enjoy a full and undisturbed view of the gigantic dimensions of the majestic ruin. France had remained for nearly a quarter of an hour perfectly hidden by the shadow of the vast column at whose base he had found a resting place, and from where his eyes followed the motions of Albert and his guides, who, holding torches in their hands, had emerged from a vomitarium at the opposite extremity of the Colosseum, and then again disappeared down the steps conducting to the seats reserved for the Vestal Virgins, resembling, as they glided along, some restless shades, following the flickering glare of so many ens fatui. All at once his ear caught a sound resembling that of a stone rolling down the staircase, opposite the one by which he had himself ascended. There was nothing remarkable in the circumstance of a fragment of granite giving way and falling heavily below, but it seemed to him that the substance that fell gave way beneath the pressure of a foot, and also that someone who endeavored as much as possible to prevent his footsteps from being heard was approaching the spot where he sat. Conjecture soon became certainty, for the figure of a man was distinctly visible to France, gradually emerging from the staircase opposite, upon which the moon was at that moment pouring a full tide of silvery brightness. The stranger thus presenting himself was probably a person who, like France, preferred the enjoyment of solitude and his own thoughts to the frivolous gabble of the guides, and his appearance had nothing extraordinary in it, but the hesitation with which he proceeded, stopping and listening with anxious attention at every step he took, convinced France that he expected the arrival of some person. By a sort of instinctive impulse, France withdrew as much as possible behind his pillar, about 10 feet from the spot where he and the stranger were. The roof had given way, leaving a large round opening, through which may be seen the blue vault of heaven, thickly studded with stars. Around this opening, which had, possibly, for ages permitted a free entrance to the brilliant moonbeams that now illumined the vast pile, grew a quantity of creeping plants, whose delicate green branches stood out in bold relief against the clear azure of the firmament, while large masses of thick, strong fibrous shoots forced their way through the chasm, and hung floating to and fro, like so many waving strings. The person whose mysterious arrival had attracted the attention of France stood in a kind of half-light that rendered it impossible to distinguish his features, although his dress was easily made out. He wore a large brown mantle, one fold of which, thrown over his left shoulder, served likewise to mask the lower part of his countenance, while the upper part was completely hidden by his broad-brimmed hat. The lower part of his dress was more distinctly visible by the bright rays of the moon, which, entering through the broken ceiling, shed their refulgent beams on feet cased in elegantly made boots of polished leather, over which descended fashionably cut trousers of black cloth. From the imperfect means France had of judging, he could only come to one conclusion, that the person whom he was thus watching certainly belonged to no inferior station of life. Some few minutes had elapsed, and the stranger began to show manifest signs of impatience, when a slight noise was heard outside the aperture in the roof, and almost immediately a dark shadow seemed to obstruct the flood of light that had entered it, and the figure of a man was clearly seen gazing with eager scrutiny on the immense space beneath him. Then, as his eye caught sight of him in the mantle, he grasped a floating mass of thickly matted boughs, and glided down by their help to within 3 or 4 feet of the ground, and then leaped lightly on his feet. The man who had performed this daring act with so much indifference wore the transstevere costume. "I beg your Excellency's pardon for keeping you waiting," said the man in the Roman dialect, "but I don't think I'm many minutes after my time. 10 o'clock has just struck on the Lateran." "Say not a word about being late," replied the stranger in purest Tuscan. "It is I who am too soon. But evening, if you had caused me to wait a little while, I should have felt quite sure that the delay was not occasioned by any fault of yours." "Your Excellency is perfectly right in so thinking," said the man. "I came here direct from the castle of St. Angelo, and I had an immense deal of trouble before I could get a chance to speak to Beppo." "And who is Beppo?" "Oh, Beppo is employed in the prison, and I give him so much a year to let me know what is going on within His Holiness's castle." "Truly, you are a provident person, I see." "Why, you see, no one knows what may happen. Perhaps some of these days I may be entrapped, like poor Peppino, and may be very glad to have some little nibbling mouse to gnaw the meshes of my net, and so help me out of prison." "Briefly, what did you glean?" "That 2 executions of considerable interest will take place the day after tomorrow at 2 o'clock, as is customary at Rome at the commencement of all great festivals. One of the culprits will be Mazzolato. He is an atrocious villain who murdered the priest who brought him up, and deserves not the smallest pity. The other sufferer is sentenced to be decapitato. And he, your Excellency, is poor Peppino. Knocked on the head. Beheaded. The fact is that you have inspired not only the pontifical government, but also the neighboring states, with such extreme fear, that they are glad of all opportunity of making an example. But Peppino did not even belong to my band. He was merely a poor shepherd, whose only crime consisted in furnishing us with provisions, which makes him your accomplice to all intents and purposes. But mark the distinction with which he is treated. Instead of being knocked on the head as you would be if once they caught hold of you, he is simply sentenced to be guillotined, by which means, too, the amusements of the day are diversified, and there is a spectacle to please every spectator, without reckoning the wholly unexpected one I am preparing to surprise them with." "My good friend," said the man in the cloak, "excuse me for saying that. You seem to me precisely in the mood to commit some wild or extravagant act. Perhaps I am. But one thing I have resolved on, and that is to stop at nothing to restore a poor devil to liberty who has got into this scrape solely from having served me. I should hate and despise myself as a coward did I desert the brave fellow in his present extremity." "And what do you mean to do?" "To surround the scaffold with 20 of my best men, who, at a signal from me, will rush forward directly Peppino is brought for execution, and, by the assistance of their stilettos, drive back the guard, and carry off the prisoner." "That seems to me as hazardous as uncertain, and convinces me that my scheme is far better than yours." "And what is your Excellency's project?" "Just this. I will so advantageously bestow 2 piasters that the person receiving them shall obtain a respite till next year for Peppino. and during that year another skillfully placed 10 piasters will afford him the means of escaping from his prison. And do you feel sure of succeeding? Pardieu, exclaimed the man in the cloak, suddenly expressing himself in French. What did your excellency say? Inquired the other. I said, my good fellow, that I would do more single-handed by the means of gold than you and all your troop could effect with stilettos, pistols, carbines, and blunderbusses included. Leave me, then, to act and have no fears for the result. At least, there can be no harm in myself and party being in readiness, in case your excellency should fail. None whatever. Take what precautions you please, if it is any satisfaction to you to do so, but rely upon my obtaining the reprieve I seek. Remember, the execution is fixed for the day after tomorrow, and that you have but 1 day to work in. And what of that? Is not a day divided into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, and every minute subdivided into 60 seconds? Now in 400 seconds very many things can be done. And how shall I know whether your excellency has succeeded or not? Oh, that is very easily arranged. I have engaged the 3 lower windows at the Café Rospoli. Should I have obtained the requisite pardon for Peppino, the 2 outside windows will be hung with yellow damasks, and the center with white, having a large cross in red marked on it. And whom will you employ to carry the reprieve to the officer directing the execution? Send one of your men, disguised as a penitent friar, and I will give it to him. His dress will procure him the means of approaching the scaffold itself, and he will deliver the official order to the officer, who, in his turn, will hand it to the executioner. In the meantime, it will be as well to acquaint Peppino with what we have determined on, if it be only to prevent his dying of fear or losing his senses, because in either case a very useless expense will have been incurred. Your excellency, said the man, you are fully persuaded of my entire devotion to you, are you not? No, I flatter myself that there can be no doubt of it, replied the cavalier in the cloak. Well, then, only fulfill your promise of rescuing Peppino, and henceforward you shall receive not only devotion, but the most absolute obedience from myself and those under me that one human being can render to another. Have a care how far you pledge yourself, my good friend, for I may remind you of your promise at some, perhaps, not very distant period, when I, in my turn, may require your aid and influence. Let that day come sooner or later. Your excellency will find me what I have found you in this my heavy trouble, and if from the other end of the world you but write me word to do such or such a thing, you may regard it as done, for done it shall be, on the word and faith of— Hush, interrupted the stranger, I hear a noise. It is some travelers who are visiting the Colosseum by torchlight. It were better we should not be seen together. Those guides are nothing but spies and may possibly recognize you, and however I may be honored by your friendship, my worthy friend, if once the extent of our intimacy were known, I am sadly afraid both my reputation and credit would suffer by that. Well, then, if you obtain the reprieve, the middle window at the Café Rospoli will be hung with white damask, bearing a red cross, and if you fail, then all 3 windows will have yellow draperies. And then, my good fellow, use your daggers in any way you please, and I further promise you to be there as a spectator of your prowess. We understand each other perfectly, then. Adieu, your excellency. Depend upon me as firmly as I do upon you. Saying these words, the Transteverin disappeared down the staircase, while his companion, muffling his features more closely than before in the folds of his mantle, passed almost close to France and descended to the arena by an outward flight of steps. The next minute France heard himself called by Albert, who made the lofty building re-echo with the sound of his friend's name. France, however, did not obey the summons till he had satisfied himself that the two men whose conversation he had overheard were at a sufficient distance to prevent his encountering them. In his descent, in 10 minutes after the strangers had departed, France was on the road to the Piazza de Spagni, listening with studied indifference to the learned dissertation delivered by Albert, after the manner of Pliny and Calpurnius, touching the iron-pointed nets used to prevent the ferocious beasts from springing on the spectators. France let him proceed without interruption, and, in fact, did not hear what was said. He longed to be alone and free to ponder over all that had occurred. One of the two men, whose mysterious meeting in the Colosseum he had so unintentionally witnessed, was an entire stranger to him, but not so the other, and though France had been unable to distinguish his features from his being either wrapped in his mantle or obscured by the shadow, the tones of his voice had made too powerful an impression on him the first time he had heard them for him ever again to forget them, hear them when or where he may. It was more especially when this man was speaking in a manner half jesting, half bitter, that France's ear recalled most vividly the deep sonorous, yet well-pitched voice that had addressed him in the grotto of Monte Cristo, and which he heard for the second time amid the darkness and ruined grandeur of the Colosseum. And the more he thought, the more entire was his conviction that the person who wore the mantle was no other than his former host and entertainer, Sinbad the sailor. Under any other circumstances, France would have found it impossible to resist his extreme curiosity to know more of so singular a personage, and with that intent have sought to renew their short acquaintance. But, in the present instance, the confidential nature of the conversation he had overheard made him, with propriety, judge that his appearance at such a time would be anything but agreeable. As we have seen, therefore, he permitted his former host to retire without attempting a recognition, but fully promising himself a rich indemnity for his present forbearance, should chance afford him another opportunity. In vain did France endeavor to forget the many perplexing thoughts which assailed him. In vain did he court the refreshment of sleep. Slumber refused to visit his eyelids, and the night was passed in feverish contemplation of the chain of circumstances tending to prove the identity of the mysterious visitant to the Colosseum with the inhabitant of the grotto of Monte Cristo, and the more he thought, the firmer grew his opinion on the subject. Worn out at length, he fell asleep at daybreak and did not awake till late. Like a genuine Frenchman, Albert had employed his time in arranging for the evening's diversion. He had sent to engage a box at the Teatro Argentino, and France, having a number of letters to write, relinquished the carriage to Albert for the whole of the day. At 5 o'clock Albert returned, delighted with his day's work. He had been occupied in leaving his letters of introduction, and had received in return more invitations to balls and routs than it would be possible for him to accept. Besides this, he had seen, as he called it, all the remarkable sights at Rome. Yes, in a single day he had accomplished what his more serious-minded companion would have taken weeks to effect. Neither had he neglected to ascertain the name of the piece to be played that night at the Teatro Argentino, and also what performers appeared in it. The opera of Parisina was announced for representation, and the principal actors were Caselli, Morini, and La Specchia. The young men, therefore, had reason to consider themselves fortunate in having the opportunity of hearing one of the best works by the composer of Lucia di Lammermoor, supported by three of the most renowned vocalists of Italy. Albert had never been able to endure the Italian theaters, with their orchestras from which it is impossible to see, and the absence of balconies or open boxes. All these defects pressed hard on a man who had had his stall at the Bouffes and had shared a lower box at the opera. Still, in spite of this, Albert displayed his most dazzling and effective costumes each time he visited the theaters, but, alas, his elegant toilet was wholly thrown away, and one of the most worthy representatives of Parisian fashion had to carry with him the mortifying reflection that he had nearly overrun Italy without meeting with a single adventure. Sometimes Albert would affect to make a joke of his want of success, but internally he was deeply wounded, and his self-love immensely piqued. To think that Albert de Morcerf, the most admired and most sought after of any young person of his day, should thus be passed over, and merely have his labor for his pains. And the thing was so much the more annoying, as according to the characteristic modesty of a Frenchman, Albert had quitted Paris with a full conviction that he had only to show himself in Italy to carry all before him, and that upon his return he should astonish the Parisian world with the recital of his numerous love affairs. Alas, poor Albert! None of those interesting adventures fell in his way. The lovely Genoese, Florentines, and Neapolitans were all faithful, if not to their husbands, at least to their lovers, and thought not of changing evening for the splendid appearance of Albert de Morcerf. And all he gained was the painful conviction that the ladies of Italy have this advantage over those of France, that they are faithful, evening in their infidelity. Yet he could not restrain a hope that in Italy, as elsewhere, there may be an exception to the general rule. Albert, besides being an elegant, well-looking young man, was also possessed of considerable talent and ability. Moreover, he was a viscount, a recently created one, certainly, but in the present day it is not necessary to go as far back as know in tracing a descent, and a genealogical tree is equally estimated, whether dated from 1399 or merely 1815. But to crown all these advantages, Albert de Morcerf commanded an income of 50 livres, a more than sufficient sum to render him a personage of considerable importance in Paris. It was, therefore, no small mortification to him to have visited most of the principal cities in Italy without having excited the most trifling observation. Albert, however, hoped to indemnify himself for all these slights and indifferences during the carnival, knowing full well that, among the different states and kingdoms in which this festivity is celebrated, Rome is the spot where evening the wisest and gravest throw off the usual rigidity of their lives and deign to mingle in the follies of this time of liberty and relaxation. The carnival was to commence on the morrow. Therefore Albert had not an instant to lose in setting forth the program of his hopes, expectations, and claims to notice. With this design he had engaged a box in the most conspicuous part of the theatre, and exerted himself to set off his personal attractions by the aid of the most rich and elaborate toilet. The box taken by Albert was in the first circle, although each of the 3 tiers of boxes is deemed equally aristocratic and is, for this reason, generally styled the nobility's boxes, and although the box engaged for the 2 friends was sufficiently capacious to contain at least a dozen persons, it had cost less than would be paid at some of the French theaters for one admitting merely 4 occupants. Another motive had influenced Albert's selection of his seat, who knew but that, thus advantageously placed, he may not in truth attract the notice of some fair Roman, and an introduction may ensue that would procure him the offer of a seat in a carriage, or a place in a princely balcony, from which he may behold the gaieties of the carnival. These united considerations made Albert more lively and anxious to please than he had hitherto been. Totally disregarding the business of the stage, he leaned from his box and began attentively scrutinizing the beauty of each pretty woman, aided by a powerful opera glass. But, alas, this attempt to attract notice wholly failed. Not evening curiosity had been excited, and it was but too apparent that the lovely creatures, into whose good graces he was desirous of stealing, were all so much engrossed with themselves, their lovers, or their own thoughts, that they had not so much as noticed him or the manipulation of his glass. The truth was that they anticipated pleasures of the carnival with the Holy Week that was to succeed it, so filled every fair breast as to prevent the least attention being bestowed evening on the business of the stage. The actors made their entries and exits unobserved or unthought of, At certain conventional moments, the spectators would suddenly cease their conversation or rouse themselves from their musings to listen to some brilliant effort of Moriani's, a well-executed recitative by Caselli, or to join in loud applause at the wonderful powers of La Specchia. But that momentary excitement over, they quickly relapsed into their former state of preoccupation or interesting conversation. Towards the close of the first act, the door of a box which had been hitherto vacant was opened. A lady entered to whom France had been introduced in Paris, where truly he had imagined she still was. The quick eye of Albert caught the involuntary start with which his friend beheld the new arrival, and turning to him, he said hastily, "Do you know the woman who has just entered that box?" "Yes." "What do you think of her?" "Oh, she is perfectly lovely. What a complexion, and such magnificent hair." "Is she French?" "No, a Venetian, and her name is Countess G." "Ah, I know her by name," exclaimed Albert. "She is said to possess as much wit and cleverness as beauty. I was to have been presented to her when I met her at Madame Villefort's ball." "Shall I assist you in repairing your negligence?" asked France. "My dear fellow, are you really on such good terms with her as to venture to take me to her box?" "Why, I have only had the honor of being in her society and conversing with her 3 or 4 times in my life. But you know that evening such an acquaintance as that may warrant my doing what you ask." At that instant, the Countess perceived France and graciously waved her hand to him, to which he replied by a respectful inclination of the head. "Upon my word," said Albert, "you seem to be on excellent terms with the beautiful Countess." "You are mistaken in thinking so," returned France calmly, "but you merely fall into the same error which leads so many of our countrymen to commit the most egregious blunders, I mean that of judging the habits and customs of Italy and Spain by our Parisian notions. Believe me, nothing is more fallacious than to form any estimate of the degree of intimacy you may suppose existing among persons by the familiar terms they seem upon. There is a similarity of feeling at this instant between ourselves and the Countess, nothing more. Is there, truly, my good fellow? Pray tell me, is it sympathy of heart? No, of taste," continued France gravely. "And in what manner has this congeniality of mind been evinced?" "By the Countess's visiting the Colosseum, as we did last night, by moonlight, and nearly alone." "You were with her, then?" "I was." "And what did you say to her?" "Oh, we talked of the illustrious dead of whom that magnificent ruin is a glorious monument." "Upon my word," cried Albert, "you must have been a very entertaining companion alone, or all but alone, with a beautiful woman in such a place of sentiment as the Colosseum, and yet to find nothing better talk about than the dead. All I can say is if ever I should get such a chance, the living should be my theme, and you will probably find your theme ill chosen." "But," said Albert, breaking in upon his discourse, "never mind the past, let us only remember the present. Are you not going to keep your promise of introducing me to the fair subject of our remarks?" "Certainly, directly the curtain falls on the stage. What a confounded time this first act takes! I believe, on my soul, that they never mean to finish it." "Oh, yes, they will. Only listen to that charming finale. How exquisitely Caselli sings his part. But what an awkward, inelegant fellow he is. Well, then, what do you say to La Specchia? Did you ever see anything more perfect than her acting? Why, you know, my dear fellow, when one has been accustomed to Malibran and Sontag, such singers as these don't make the same impression on you. They perhaps do on others. At least, you must admire Moriani's style and execution. I never fancied men of his dark, ponderous appearance singing with a voice like a woman's." "My good friend," said France, turning to him, while Albert continued to point his glass at every box in the theater, "you seem determined not to approve. You are really too difficult to please." The curtain at length fell on the performances, to the infinite satisfaction of the Viscount of Morcerf, who seized his hat, rapidly passed his fingers through his hair, arranged his cravat and wristbands, and signified to France that he was waiting for him to lead the way. France, who had mutely interrogated the Countess, and received from her a gracious smile in token that he would be welcome, sought not to retard the gratification of Albert's eager impatience, but began at once the tour of the house, closely followed by Albert, who availed himself of the few minutes required to reach the opposite side of the theatre to settle the height and smoothness of his collar and to arrange the lappets of his coat. This important task was just completed as they arrived at the Countess's box. At the knock, the door was immediately opened, and the young man who was seated beside the Countess, in obedience to the Italian custom, instantly rose and surrendered his place to the strangers who, in turn, would be expected to retire upon the arrival of other visitors. France presented Albert as one of the most distinguished young men of the day, both as regarded his position in society and extraordinary talents. Nor did he say more than the truth, for in Paris and the circle in which the Viscount moved, he was looked upon and cited as a model of perfection. France added that his companion, deeply grieved at having been prevented the honor of being presented to the Countess during her sojourn in Paris, was most anxious to make up for it, and had requested him France to remedy the past misfortune by conducting him to her box, and concluded by asking pardon for his presumption in having taken it upon himself to do so. The Countess, in reply, bowed gracefully to Albert, and extended her hand with cordial kindness to France. Then, inviting Albert to take the vacant seat beside her, she recommended France to take the next best if he wished to view the ballet, and pointed to the one behind her own chair. Albert was soon deeply engrossed in discoursing upon Paris and Persian matters, speaking to the Countess of the various persons they both knew there. France perceived how completely he was in his element, and, unwilling to interfere with the pleasure he so evidently felt, took up Albert's glass and began in his turn to survey the audience. Sitting alone in the front of a box immediately opposite, but situated on the third row, was a woman of exquisite beauty, dressed in a Greek costume, which, evidently from the ease and grace with which she wore it, was her national attire. Behind her, but in deep shadow, was the outline of a masculine figure, but the features of this latter personage it was not possible to distinguish. France could not forbear breaking in upon the apparently interesting conversation passing between the Countess and Albert, to inquire of the former if she knew who was the fair Albanian opposite, since beauty such as hers was well worthy of being observed by either sex. "All I can tell about her," replied the Countess, "is that she has been at Rome since the beginning of the season, for I saw her where she now sits the very first night of the season, and since then she has never missed a performance. Sometimes she is accompanied by the person who is now with her, and at others she is merely attended by a black servant." "And what do you think of her personal appearance?" "Oh, I consider her perfectly lovely. She is just my idea of what Medora must have been." France and the Countess exchanged a smile, and then the latter resumed her conversation with Albert, while France returned to his previous survey of the house and company. The curtain rose on the ballet, which was one of those excellent specimens of the Italian school, admirably arranged and put on the stage by Henry, who has established for himself a great reputation throughout Italy for his taste and skill in the choreographic art, one of those masterly productions of grace, method, and elegance in which the whole corps de ballet, from the principal dancers to the humblest supernumerary, are all engaged on the stage at the same time, and 150 persons may be seen exhibiting the same attitude, or elevating the same arm or leg with a simultaneous movement that would lead you to suppose that but one mind, one act of volition, influenced the moving mass. The ballet was called Polska. However much the ballet may have claimed his attention, France was too deeply occupied with the beautiful Greek to take any note of it, while she seemed to experience an almost childlike delight in watching it, her eager, animated looks contrasting strongly with the utter indifference of her companion who, during the whole time the piece lasted, never evening moved, not evening when the furious, crashing din produced by the trumpets, cymbals, and Chinese bells sounded their loudest from the orchestra. Of this he took no heed, but was, as far as appearances may be trusted, enjoying soft repose and bright celestial dreams. The ballet at length came to a close, and the curtain fell amid the loud, unanimous plaudits of an enthusiastic and delighted audience. Owing to the very judicious plan of dividing the two acts of the opera, with the ballet, the pauses between the performances are very short, the singers in the opera having time to repose themselves and change their costume, when necessary, while the dancers are executing their pirouettes and exhibiting their graceful steps. The overture to the second act began, and at the first sound of the leader's bow across his violin, France observed the sleeper slowly arise and approach the Greek girl, who turned around to say a few words to him, and then, leaning forward again on the railing of her box, she became as absorbed as before in what was going on. The countenance of the person who had addressed her remained so completely in the shade that, though France tried his utmost, he could not distinguish a single feature. The curtain rose, and the attention of France was attracted by the actors, and his eyes turned from the box containing the Greek girl and her strange companion to watch the business of the stage. Most of my readers are aware that the second act of Parisina opens with the celebrated and effective duet in which Parisina, while sleeping, betrays to Atso the secret of her love for Hugo. The injured husband goes through all the emotions of jealousy until conviction seizes on his mind, and then, in a frenzy of rage and indignation, he awakens his guilty wife to tell her that he knows her guilt and to threaten her with his vengeance. This duet is one of the most beautiful, expressive, and terrible conceptions that has ever emanated from the fruitful pen of Dynasty. France now listened to it for the third time, yet its notes, so tenderly expressive and fearfully grand as the wretched husband and wife give vent to their different griefs and passions, thrilled through the soul of France with an effect equal to his first emotions upon hearing it. Excited beyond his usual calm demeanor, France rose with the audience and was about to join the loud, enthusiastic applause that followed, but suddenly his purpose was arrested, his hands fell by his sides, and the half-uttered bravos expired on his lips. The occupant of the box in which the Greek girl sat appeared to share the universal admiration that prevailed, for he left his seat to stand up in front, so that, his countenance being fully revealed, France had no difficulty in recognizing him as the mysterious inhabitant of Monte Cristo, and the very same person he had encountered the preceding evening in the ruins of the Colosseum, and whose voice and figure had seemed so familiar to him. All doubt of his identity was now at an end. His singular host evidently resided at Rome. The surprise and agitation occasioned by this full confirmation of France's former suspicion had no doubt imparted a corresponding expression to his features, for the Countess, after gazing with a puzzled look at his face, burst into a fit of laughter, and begged to know what had happened. Countess, returned France, totally unheeding her raillery, I asked you a short time since if you knew any particulars respecting the Albanian lady opposite. I must now beseech you to inform me who and what is her husband. No, answered the Countess, I know no more of him than yourself. Perhaps you never before noticed him? What a question, so truly French. Do you not know that we Italians have eyes only for the man we love? True, replied France. All I can say is, continued the Countess, taking up the lorgnette and directing it toward the box in question, that the gentleman, whose history I am unable to furnish, seems to me as though he had just been dug up. He looks more like a corpse permitted by some friendly grave digger to quit his tomb for a while and revisit this earth of ours than anything human. How ghastly pale he is! Oh, he is always as colorless as you now see him, said France. Then you know him? Almost screamed the Countess. Oh, pray do, for heaven's sake, tell us all about. Is he a vampire, or a resuscitated corpse, or what? I fancy I have seen him before, and I even think he recognizes me. And I can well understand, said the Countess, shrugging up her beautiful shoulders as though an involuntary shudder passed through her veins, that those who have once seen that man will never be likely to forget him. The sensation experienced by France was evidently not peculiar to himself. Another, and wholly uninterested person, felt the same unaccountable awe and misgiving. Well, inquired France, after the Countess had a second time directed her lorgnette at the box, what do you think of our opposite neighbor? Why, that he is no other than Lord Ruthven himself in a living form. This fresh allusion to Byron * drew a smile to France's countenance, although he could but allow that if anything was likely to induce belief in the existence of vampires, it would be the presence of such a man as the mysterious personage before him. I must positively find out who and what he is, said France, rising from his seat. No, no, cried the Countess, you must not leave me. I depend upon you to escort me home. Oh, truly, I cannot permit you to go. Scott, of course, the son of an ill-fated sire, and the father of a yet more unfortunate family, bore in his looks that cast of inauspicious melancholy by which the physiognomists of that time pretended to distinguish those who were predestined to a violent and unhappy death. Abbot, ch. Roman 22. Is it possible, whispered France, that you entertain any fear? I'll tell you, answered the Countess. Byron had the most perfect belief in the existence of vampires, and evening assured me that he had seen them. The description he gave me perfectly corresponds with the features and character of the man before us. Oh, he is the exact personification of what I have been led to expect. The coal-black hair, large bright, glittering eyes in which a wild, unearthly fire seems burning, the same ghastly paleness. Then observe, too, that the woman with him is altogether unlike all others of her sex. She is a foreigner, a stranger. Nobody knows who she is or where she comes from. No doubt she belongs to the same horrible race he does, and is, like himself, a dealer in magical arts. I entreat of you not to go near him, at least tonight, and if tomorrow your curiosity still continues as great, pursue your researches if you will, but tonight you neither can nor shall. For that purpose I mean to keep you all to myself. France protested he could not defer his pursuit till the following day, for many reasons. Listen to me, said the Countess, and do not be so very headstrong. I am going home. I have a party at my house tonight, and therefore cannot possibly remain till the end of the opera. Now, I cannot for one instant believe you so devoid of gallantry as to refuse a lady your escort when she evening condescends to ask you for it. There was nothing else left for France to do but to take up his hat, open the door of the box, and offer the Countess his arm. It was quite evident by her manner that her uneasiness was not feigned, and France himself could not resist a feeling of superstitious dread, so much the stronger in him, as it arose from a variety of corroborative recollections, while the terror of the Countess sprang from an instinctive belief, originally created in her mind by the wild tales she had listened to till she believed them truths. France could evening feel her arm tremble as he assisted her into the carriage. Upon arriving at her hotel, France perceived that she had deceived him when she spoke of expecting company. On the contrary, her own return before the appointed hour seemed greatly to astonish the servants, Excuse my little subterfuge, said the Countess, in reply to her companion's half-reproachful observation on the subject, but that horrid man had made me feel quite uncomfortable, and I long to be alone, that I may compose my startled mind. France essayed to smile. No, said she, do not smile. It ill accords with the expression of your countenance, and I am sure it does not spring from your heart. However, promise me one thing. What is it? Promise me, I say. I will do anything you desire, except relinquish my determination of finding out who this man is. I have more reasons than you can imagine for desiring to know who he is, from where he came, and where he is going. Where he comes from I am ignorant, but I can readily tell you where he is going to, and that is down below, without the least doubt. Let us only speak of the promise you wished me to make, said France. Well, then, you must give me your word to return immediately to your hotel, and make no attempt to follow this man tonight. There are certain affinities between the persons we quit and those we meet afterwards. For heaven's sake, do not serve as a conductor between that man and me. Pursue your chase after him to tomorrow as eagerly as you please, but never bring him near me, if you would not see me die of terror. And now, good night. Go to your rooms and try to sleep away all recollections of this evening. For my own part, I am quite sure I shall not be able to close my eyes. So saying, the Countess quitted France, leaving him unable to decide whether she were merely amusing herself at his expense, or whether her fears and agitations were genuine. Upon his return to the hotel, France found Albert in his dressing gown and slippers, listlessly extended on a sofa, smoking a cigar. "My dear fellow," cried he, springing up, "is it really you? Why, I did not expect to see you before to-morrow." "My dear Albert," replied France, "I am glad of this opportunity to tell you, once and forever, that you entertain a most erroneous notion concerning Italian women. I should have thought the continual failures you have met with in all your own love affairs may have taught you better by this time. Upon my soul, these women would puzzle the very devil to read them aright. Why, here, they give you their hand, they press yours in return, they keep up a whispering conversation, permit you to accompany them home. Why, if a Parisian were to indulge in a quarter of these marks of flattering attention, her reputation would be gone forever. And the very reason why the women of this fine country put so little restraint on their words and actions is because they live so much in public and have really nothing to conceal. Besides, you must have perceived that the Countess was really alarmed. At what? At the sight of that respectable gentleman sitting opposite to us in the same box with the lovely Greek girl. Now, for my part, I met them in the lobby after the conclusion of the piece, and hang me if I can guess where you took your notions of the other world from. I can assure you that this hobgoblin of yours is a deuced fine-looking fellow, admirably dressed. Truly, I feel quite sure, from the cut of his clothes, they are made by a first-rate Paris tailor, probably Blin or Human. He was rather too pale, certainly, but then, you know, paleness is always looked upon as a strong proof of aristocratic descent and distinguished breeding. France smiled, for he well remembered that Albert particularly prided himself on the entire absence of color in his own complexion. "Well, that tends to confirm my own ideas," said France, that the Countess's suspicions were destitute alike of sense and reason. "Did he speak in your hearing? And did you catch any of his words?" "I did, but they were uttered in the Ramaic dialect. I knew that from the mixture of Greek words. I don't know whether I ever told you that. When I was at college I was rather strong in Greek." "He spoke the Ramaic language, did he?" "I think so." "That settles it," murmured France. "It is he, past all doubt." "What do you say?" "Nothing, nothing. But tell me, what were you thinking about when I came in?" "Oh, I was arranging a little surprise for you." "Truly, of what nature?" Why, you know it is quite impossible to procure a carriage, certainly, and I also know that we have done all that human means afforded to endeavor to get one. Now, then, in this difficulty a bright idea has flashed across my brain. France looked at Albert as though he had not much confidence in the suggestions of his imagination. I tell you what, Sir France, cried Albert, you deserve to be called out for such a misgiving and incredulous glance as that you were pleased to bestow on me just now, and I promise to give you the satisfaction of a gentleman if your scheme turns out as ingenious as you assert. Well, then, hearken to me. I listen. You agree, do you not, that obtaining a carriage is out of the question? I do. Neither can we procure horses. True, we have offered any sum, but have failed. Well, now, what do you say to a cart? I dare say such a thing may be had, very possibly, and a pair of oxen, as easily found as the cart. Then you see, my good fellow, with a cart and a couple of oxen our business can be managed. The cart must be tastefully ornamented, and if you and I dress ourselves as Neapolitan reapers, we may get up a striking tableau after the manner of that splendid picture by Leopold. Robert, it would add greatly to the effect if the Countess would join us in the costume of a peasant from Puzzoli or Sorrento. Our group would then be quite complete, more especially as the Countess is quite beautiful enough to represent a Madonna. Well, said France, this time, Albert, I am bound to give you credit for having hit upon a most capital idea, and quite a national one, too, replied Albert with gratified pride. A mere mask borrowed from our own festivities. Ha, ha, ye Romans, you thought to make us unhappy strangers trot at the heels of your processions like so many lazzaroni, because no carriages or horses are to be had in your beggarly city. But you don't know us. When we can have one thing we invent another. And have you communicated your triumphant idea to anybody? Only to our host. Upon my return home I sent for him, and I then explained to him what I wished to procure. He assured me that nothing would be easier than to furnish all I desired. One thing I was sorry for. When I bade him have the horns of the oxen gilded, he told me there would not be time, as it would require 3 days to do that. So you see, we must do without this little superfluity. And where is he now? Who? Our host. Gone out in search of our equipage. By tomorrow it may be too late. Then he will be able to give us an answer tonight. Oh, I expect him every minute. At this instant the door opened, and the head of Signor Pastrini appeared. Permesso? Inquired he. Certainly, certainly, cried France. Come in, mine host. Now, then, asked Albert eagerly, have you found the desired cart and oxen? Better than that, replied Signor Pastrini, with the air of a man perfectly well satisfied with himself. Take care, my worthy host, said Albert. Better is a sure enemy to. Well, let your excellencies only leave the matter to me, returned Signor Pastrini in a tone indicative of unbounded self-confidence. But what have you done? Asked France. Speak out. There's a worthy fellow. Your excellencies are aware, responded the landlord, swelling with importance, that the Count of Monte Cristo is living on the same floor with yourselves. I should think we did know it, exclaimed Albert, since it is owing to that circumstance that we are packed into these small rooms, like two poor students in the back streets of Paris. When, then, the Count of Monte Cristo, hearing of the dilemma in which you are placed, has sent to offer you seats in his carriage and 2 places at his windows in the Palazzo Rospoli. The friends looked at each other with unutterable surprise. But do you think, asked Albert, that we ought to accept such offers from a perfect stranger? What sort of person is this Count of Monte Cristo? Asked France of his host. A very great nobleman, but whether Maltese or Sicilian I cannot exactly say, but this I know, that he is noble as a Borghese and rich as a gold mine. It seems to me, said France, speaking in an undertone to Albert, that, if this person merited the high panegyrics of our landlord, he would have conveyed his invitation through another channel, and not permitted it to be brought to us in this unceremonious way. He will have written, or, at this instant someone knocked at the door. Come in, said France. A servant, wearing a livery of considerable style and richness, appeared at the threshold and placing 2 cards in the landlord's hands, who immediately presented them to the 2 young men, he said, please to deliver these from the Count of Monte Cristo to Viscount Albert de Morcerf and M. France d'Epinay. The Count of Monte Cristo, continued the servant, begs these gentlemen's permission to wait upon them as their neighbor, and he will be honored by an intimation of what time they will please to receive him. Faith, France, whispered Albert, there is not much to find fault with. Here, tell the Count, replied France, that we will do ourselves the pleasure of calling on him. The servant bowed and retired. That is what I call an elegant mode of attack, said Albert. You were quite correct in what you said, Signor Pastrini. The Count of Monte Cristo is unquestionably a man of first-rate breeding and knowledge of the world. Then you accept his offer? Said the host. Of course we do, replied Albert. Still, I must own I am sorry to be obliged to give up the cart and the group of reapers. It would have produced such an effect, and were it not for the windows at the Palazzo Rospoli, by way of recompense for the loss of our beautiful scheme, I don't know but what I should have held on by my original plan. What say you, France? Oh, I agree with you. The windows in the Palazzo Rospoli alone decided me. The truth was that the mention of 2 places in the Palazzo Rospoli had recalled to France the conversation he had overheard the preceding evening in the ruins of the Colosseum between the mysterious unknown and the Transteverin, in which the stranger in the cloak had undertaken to obtain the freedom of a condemned criminal, and if this muffled-up individual proved, as France felt sure he would, the same as the person he had just seen in the Teatro Argentino, then he should be able to establish his identity, and also to prosecute his researches respecting him with perfect facility and freedom. France passed the night in confused dreams respecting the 2 meetings he had already had with his mysterious tormentor, and in waking speculations as to what the tomorrow would produce. The next day must clear up every doubt, and, unless his near neighbor and would-be friend, the Count of Monte Cristo, possessed the ring of Gyges and by its power was able to render himself invisible, it was very certain he could not escape this time. 8 o'clock found France up and dressed, while Albert, who had not the same motives for early rising, was still soundly asleep. The first act of France was to summon his landlord, who presented himself with his accustomed obsequiousness. Pray, Signor Pastrini, asked France, is not some execution appointed to take place today? Yes, Your Excellency, but if your reason for inquiry is that you may procure a window to view it from, you are much too late. Oh, no, answered France, I had no such intention. And even if I had felt a wish to witness the spectacle, I may have done so from Monte Cristo, could I not? Ah, exclaimed mine host, I did not think it likely your Excellency would have chosen to mingle with such a rabble as are always collected on that hill, which, truly, they consider as exclusively belonging to themselves. Very possibly I may not go, answered France, but in case I feel disposed, give me some particulars of today's executions. What particulars would your Excellency like to hear? Why, the number of persons condemned to suffer, their names, and description of the death they are to die. That happens just lucky, Your Excellency. Only a few minutes ago they brought me the tavolettas. What are they? Sort of wooden tablets hung up at the corners of streets the evening before an execution. on which is pasted up a paper containing the names of the condemned persons, their crimes, and mode of punishment. The reason for so publicly announcing all this is that all good and faithful Catholics may offer up their prayers for the unfortunate culprits and, above all, beseech of heaven to grant them a sincere repentance. And these tablets are brought to you that you may add your prayers to those of the faithful, are they? Asked France somewhat incredulously. Oh, dear, no, Your Excellency, I have not time for anybody's affairs, but my own and those of my honorable guests. But I make an agreement with the man who pastes up the papers, and he brings them to me as he would the playbills, that in case any person staying at my hotel should like to witness an execution, he may obtain every requisite information concerning the time and place, etc. Upon my word, that is a most delicate attention on your part, Signor Pastrini, cried France. Why, Your Excellency, returned the landlord, chuckling and rubbing his hands with infinite complacency, I think I may take upon myself to say I neglect nothing to deserve the support and patronage of the noble visitors to this poor hotel. I see that plainly enough, my most excellent host, and you may rely upon me to proclaim so striking a proof of your attention to your guests wherever I go. Meanwhile, oblige me by a sight of one of these tavolettas. Nothing can be easier than to comply with your Excellency's wish, said the landlord, opening the door of the chamber. I have caused one to be placed on the landing, close by your apartment. Then, taking the tablet from the wall, he handed it to France, who read as follows. The public is informed that on Wednesday, February 23d, being the first day of the carnival, executions will take place in the Piazza del Popolo, by order of the Tribunal of the Rota, of two persons, named Andrea Randola and Peppino, otherwise called Rocca Priori, the former, found guilty of the murder of a venerable and exemplary priest, named Don Cesar Torlini, canon of the Church of St. John Lateran, and the latter convicted of being an accomplice of the atrocious and sanguinary bandit Luigi Vampa and his band. The first named malefactor will be subjected to the Mazzuola, the second culprit beheaded. The prayers of all good Christians are entreated for these unfortunate men, that it may please God to awaken them to a sense of their guilt and to grant them a hearty and sincere repentance for their crimes. This was precisely what France had heard the evening before in the ruins of the Colosseum. No part of the program differed. The names of the condemned persons, their crimes, and mode of punishment all agreed with his previous information. In all probability, therefore, the Transteverin was no other than the bandit Luigi Vampa himself, and the man shrouded in the mantle the same he had known as Sinbad the Sailor, but who, no doubt, was still pursuing his philanthropic expedition in Rome, as he had already done at Porto Vecchio and Tunis. Time was getting on, however, and France deemed it advisable to awaken Albert, but at the moment he prepared to proceed to his chamber, his friend entered the room in perfect costume for the day. The anticipated delights of the carnival had so run in his head as to make him leave his pillow long before his usual hour. Now, my excellent Signor Pastrini, said France, addressing his landlord, since we are both ready, do you think we may proceed at once to visit the Count of Monte Cristo? Most assuredly, replied he. The Count of Monte Cristo is always an early riser, and I can answer for his having been up these 2 hours. Then you really consider we shall not be intruding if we pay our respects to him directly? Oh, I am quite sure. I will take all the blame on myself if you find I have led you into an error. Well, then, if it be so, are you ready, Albert? Perfectly. Let us go and return our best thanks for his courtesy. Yes, let us do so. The landlord preceded the friends across the landing, which was all that separated them from the apartments of the Count, rang at the bell, and upon the door being opened by a servant, said, I Signori Francesi. The domestic bowed respectfully, and invited them to enter. They passed through 2 rooms, furnished in a luxurious manner they had not expected to see you under the roof of Signor Pastrini, and were shown into an elegantly fitted-up drawing-room. The richest Turkey carpets covered the floor, and the softest and most inviting couches, easy chairs, and sofas offered their high-piled and yielding cushions to such as desired repose or refreshment. Splendid paintings by the first masters were ranged against the walls, intermingled with magnificent trophies of war, while heavy curtains of costly tapestry were suspended before the different doors of the room. "If your excellencies will please to be seated," said the man, "I will let the count know that you are here." And with these words he disappeared behind one of the tapestried portieres. As the door opened, the sound of a guzzler reached the ears of the young men, but was almost immediately lost, for the rapid closing of the door merely allowed one rich swell of harmony to enter. France and Albert looked inquiringly at each other, then at the gorgeous furnishings of the apartment. Everything seemed more magnificent at a second view than it had done at their first rapid survey. "Well," said France to his friend, "what think you of all this?" "Why, upon my soul, my dear fellow, it strikes me that our elegant and attentive neighbor must either be some successful stock jobber who has speculated in the fall of the Spanish funds, or some prince traveling incog." "Hush, hush," replied France. "We shall ascertain who and what he is. He comes." As France spoke, he heard the sound of a door turning on its hinges, and almost immediately afterwards the tapestry was drawn aside, and the owner of all these riches stood before the 2 young men.